Hey, had a long day? Well, time to take a breath and relax. Enjoy. The stupidest deaths in history. Whether you're a deli worker or a sexually deprived mortician, you gotta love getting your hands on some cold meat, and the prime gentleman that was Sir Francis Bacon was no exception to that questionable rule. Francis Bacon was a man of science. In fact, he's considered to be one of the founders of modern science. Born as a tiny little strip back in 1561 in London, Bacon was a sickly little sprite and was always easily susceptible to illness. Remember that for later. Although he was a frail fellow, he was born into a wealthy, noble family. His father was a powerful politician, and his mother was highly educated, which, during Tudor times in England, was weird for women. Nevertheless, his fortunate family situation afforded him an extensive education while he laid in bed grossly coughing up gooey globs. Between the bouts of illness, however, Bacon had a profound proclivity for the sciences. At just 12 years old, he attended the prestigious Trinity College at the University of Cambridge to make himself smarter. In doing so, though, he started to get pretty peeved with how things were being done within the scientific community. He noticed that all these smarty-pants people at the time kind of just sat around philosophizing on rather abstract aspects of the world instead of gathering evidence through practical experimentation.
I say, have you ever wondered why we're here on this earth?
I don't know, have you ever wondered why your eyes are so far apart?
Okay, rude.
This sense of scientific stagnation, he thought, was just holding humanity back from figuring out what really matters and what would actually benefit society as a whole. Now keep in mind, these were the early years of the scientific revolution in Europe, so his ideas were on par with the flow of scientific thought at the time. But if you wanted to spend time experimenting with and revolutionizing a whole-ass branch of science, you're gonna need to spend money. Lots of money. Francis just needed to get his little English mitts on some moolah. Taking advantage of his lineage and prowess, he began rubbing elbows with some major political powers. He even befriended Queen Elizabeth I herself before she crusted away into dust. He quickly rose through the ranks and established himself as a prominent political figure, eventually reaching the title of Lord Chancellor of all England in 1618. In case you're unaware, that's like the highest position of power outside of being the king or queen. Adapting his scientific method to politics, Bacon aimed to untangle legal knots and simplify laws, modernizing England's judicial system and sluggish legal processes.
He did it. Guilty!
Huh? Although his political career was flourishing, it ended rather abruptly. How? Well, you remember he needed a bunch of money, right? So ask yourself, how do politicians end up a whole lot richer than their salaries could ever possibly provide? Corruption. Yup, Bacon took a bunch of bribes, so he was ousted and quickly kicked from court in 1621 after a hefty fine and a brief stay in the Tower of London. While he had been dabbling with it on the side, Bacon was now free to pursue his passion for science full-time. He always let his scientific mind wander and wonder, always thinking up practical solutions that affected real people. Well, as fate would have it, one of his potential solutions became a real problem. While traveling in a snowstorm in 1626, Francis stared out into the icy conditions over yonder, pondering the practicality of snow for natural refrigeration purposes. You know, normal thoughts. He was then hit with an idea. Snow is cold and foodstuffs like meat usually last longer when cold, so could snow make meat cold for longer food life? It was worth a try. Francis then leapt from his carriage into the blustery blizzard and moseyed on up to a wobbly, withering woman holding a chicken.
Chicky picky, chicky picky, chicky picky, chicky picky.
Hello. Francis promptly stripped the chicken and proceeded to cram and jam fistfuls of snow into the gaping poultry hole to test his theory. Over the next several days, he would have his answer, but unbeknownst to him, the next several days were all he had left. Remember how he was pretty susceptible to the icky sickies when he was a wee lad? Well, that persisted into adulthood. So, all frigid and fragile, the immunocompromised Francis had succumbed to a cold, which quickly escalated to full-blown pneumonia. Bacon went belly up just a few days later. In his last flickers of life, he confirmed his experiment to be a success. Snow do make chicken cold. You don't have to be an expert to be an expert, something that Mr. Alan Pinkerton quickly found out as he became a prominent figure during the most tumultuous times in American history. Now, despite being remembered for his American antics, Pinkerton was actually Scottish.
Aye.
He was born in Glasgow, Scotland in 1819, but fled to the States in his young adulthood. With only a few low-poly coins in his pocket, he purchased a low-poly horse and wagon to set out and seek his fortune.
Nay.
Desperate for work, he took up a job as a cooper for a brewery in Chicago. Oh, what's a cooper? Well, it's someone who makes wooden casks and containers. Not very exciting, but with bills needing to be paid, he was kind of bent over a barrel. After a few years of building wooden cylinders, Pinkerton left the city to begin a humble life in the countryside. He built himself a cabin and started his own barrel making business since that was his only skill. But one day while he was out whacking his wood, he saw something he shouldn't have. A band of counterfeiters were counterfeiting some counterfeit money, which is illegal. But instead of immediately running to the authorities, Pinkerton instead studied their movements and patterns, mapping out their entire operation. After a few weeks, he handed in his very detailed report over to the local sheriff.
Son, I'm gonna level with you. This is beautiful. Golly, looks just like me.
With the intelligence in hand, the sheriff made the arrest. This single event gave Pinkerton a real chubster for criminal detective work, which in 1849 led to him becoming the first police detective in Chicago and the forming of his very own Pinkerton National Detective Agency, which still operates to this day. Under Pinkerton, the agency thwarted the evil deeds of many train robberies, vandals, swindlers, and thieves alike over the next several years, all while laying down the groundwork for modern investigative principles and gaining national fame. But then, in 1861, the American Civil War broke out because of states' rights. Just kidding. It was because of slavery. Slavery was, in an economic sense, pretty wonderful and critical for these southern states. From a humanitarian standpoint, it was a complete abomination. And Pinkerton shared that sentiment, having personally supported and funded abolitionist leaders. With his investigative background, Pinkerton served as the head of the Union's intelligence service. During his tenure, he uncovered various assassination plots to kill President Lincoln, apparently not all of them, provided estimates of Confederate troop numbers to Union generals, which were highly inaccurate and actually detrimental to the war effort, and even worked undercover as a Confederate soldier on multiple occasions.
Howdy, y'all. Where can I find a tumbleweed? Who the fuck is this guy?
He got found out real quick. Almost died, actually, but not yet. So yeah, while he was very successful in his pre-war detective work, he wasn't exactly Sherlock Holmesing it on the war front. But anyway, after the South got their peanuts boiled, Pinkerton returned to his detective work, mainly attempting to catch train robbers. Keyword being attempting. By the 1870s, age was catching up to him, as you can see by his beard getting longer and presumably grayer. After failing to catch infamous outlaw Jesse James, financial support started slipping. Well, in 1884, ironically enough, it would be Allen himself who would be slipping as well. Although it's often debated, the most popular story surrounding Pinkerton's death was that he had slipped on the pavement while out on a stroll. He jammed his jaw onto the ground and he sunk his teeth into his tongue. Going untreated, the wound festered and turned gangrenous over the following days, sending Pinkerton to the private eye in the sky. So, fun fact, the same exact thing actually happened to my real-life sister. You know, minus the gangrene and death. Will you quit horsing around? She's just gonna have to learn. Any fella or fellette worth their salt knows who Harry Houdini is, or was. Six Flags Great Adventure, Houdini's Great Escape, 10 out of 10 ride. Even though you know he's one of history's greatest magicians, you probably don't know how he actually died. And because he's in this video, yeah. The real-life slippery little magician came from humble beginnings. Born Erich Weiss in Austria-Hungary, teeny-weeny pre-Houdini and his family fled Europe in 1878 when he was just 4 years old. His family struggled financially, hopping from place to place in the United States, before finally settling down in 1887. In East New York City, poorly raised, in a circus is where he spent most of his days, chilling out, zipping and flipping up high from the swinging trapeze above the gals and guys. He soared up through the air and his act was pretty good. Started making money in his neighborhood. He put on his little tights and the people just stared. They said, "There goes itty bitty Eric, he's the prince of the air." Thank you. Flip forward a few years to 1891, and Eric traded in the trapeze for the ease of traps. He also traded in his name. Eric Weiss became Harry Houdini, an amalgamated name created as a tribute to magicians Harry Keller and Jean-Eugène Robert Houdin. Houdini performed various acts with his younger brother Theodore, and initial audience reception was But after meeting a fellow performer of the female variety and wifing her up, and also replacing his brother in the process, the husband and wife duo performed as the Houdinis in the late 1890s. Right before the turn of the century in 1899, Harry would soon be unable to escape his astronomical rise to fame. After meeting several managers and impressing them with his acts, he began booking performances across the nation and soon across the Atlantic in Europe. In just a year, Harry and his wife went from starving artists to raking in a modern-day equivalent of tens of thousands of dollars a month. Houdini soon became a household name. Cuffs, cars, cans, crates, there was nothing from which he couldn't escape. He and his thunderous quads and milky hamstrings even challenged the public to construct traps and bindings to hold him. Nothing could. Straitjackets? Not a problem. Locked water-filled tanks? Easy peasy. The belly of a beached sea critter? Simple stuff. Now, what was unique about Houdini was that his acts were very real. Sure, there were a few tricks here and there as fail-safes, but if unsuccessful, Houdini faced the very real possibility of serious injury or death. But that was the whole thrill of it. That was the draw. Crowds flocked to see if his latest stunt would end up being his last. Damn it. This is it.
Aw, maybe next time.
Despite escaping from boxes, tombs, chains, or sealed rooms, Houdini couldn't escape that one inevitability: death itself. It's just a shame that the master of defying death would die in such a stupid manner. On October 22nd, 1926, at the age of 52, Houdini was resting backstage while performing at the Princess Theatre in Montreal. A few Canadian fellers no-clipped into Houdini's dressing room to have a chat about the performance. One student, Jocelyn Whitehead, came forth and questioned Houdini's amazing claim that he could withstand any punch to his stomach. Now, according to witness testimony, mainly the students who were right there with him, Whitehead reportedly delivered 5 devastating blows to Houdini's abdomen before Houdini even had time to properly react. Think fast, eh? Houdini initially brushed this incident off and continued performing in agonizing pain. Over the next few days, he developed a 104-degree Fahrenheit fever. Turns out the blunt force trauma had contributed to Houdini's appendix full-on rupturing. Doctors had managed to remove the busted organ, but all the toxic appendix juices had already leaked into and poisoned his body by then. Succumbing to peritonitis, Harry Houdini's final act was escaping this mortal coil on Halloween Day, 1926. Spooky. Now this is 2 stupid deaths for the price of 1. To be honest, it's pretty sad. Homer and Langley Collier were 2 rather eccentric brothers from the same mother. Mama was an opera singer and Papa was a gynecologist, so both parents were familiar with peeling back some curtains. Having successful parents gave the boys bountiful bank accounts and solid educational opportunities. Homer studied maritime law, while Langley studied chemistry, engineering, and was a whiz at tickling the ivories. They lived in a large Harlem brownstone row house in New York City. Dad died in 1923 and Mom died in 1929. Now, once Mama Collier bit the dust, the now 40-something-year-old brothers remained in the family home while still going about their daily lives. That is, until the back of Homer's eyes blew the fuck out. With his brother now fully blind, Langley chose to quit his career to become a caretaker. In doing so, both brothers became reclusive and cut themselves off from the rest of the world. Over the years, the economics of Harlem began to shift, as did the growing fear of crime, all the more solidifying the brothers' decisions to be shut-ins. They wanted nothing to do with society, but society began gaining a curiosity with them. Now, it was no secret that the brothers came from money. Everyone knew it, including the newer, less economically inclined neighbors. That being the case, the brothers' fears soon became reality. People began attempting break-ins. In response, the brothers boarded up their broken windows and sealed any and all entrances and exits. But they didn't stop there. They wanted some insurance that even if someone did break in, they wouldn't get very far. So Langley engineered several defensive traps throughout the home, like full-on Home Alone type shit. Hello? Now, what the public didn't know was that the brothers were hoarders, like real bad hoarders. Over the years, mountains of newspapers, books, and useless junk and garbage piled up to the ceiling in nearly every room, walls of knickknacks and tunnels of trinkets. The brothers would reportedly sleep in nests fashioned out of the debris. Of course, this lifestyle was pretty friggin' unhealthy, and this only exacerbated Homer's poor health condition. Within a few years, he became paralyzed due to inflammatory rheumatism. With the combination of having nearly 15,000 medical books strewn about their home and being sons of a medical professional, the brothers actually distrusted doctors. Langley actually refused to let anyone ever see or even speak to his disabled brother. He believed that even if he did take Homer for a medical evaluation, the doctor would essentially put his brother in a grave that much faster. Instead, Langley opted for a strict regimen of oranges, bread, and peanut butter scavenged from various midnight strolls to restore Homer's vitality and vision. Didn't work. In fact, the brothers' untimely deaths would be a product of their own paranoia. In 1947, an anonymous tip-off to police reported the smell of decomposition coming from the home. They investigated and, after no response from within the home, were forced to break in. The officers were shocked to find the endless piles of densely packed trash just stuffed throughout the house. It took several men several hours to remove just a small percentage of it, just enough to find the corpse of Homer Collier, bent over in a bathrobe, dead from starvation. With Langley nowhere to be found, the police assumed that he was the one who called in the tip and skipped town. But that wasn't the case. The cleaning effort of the home continued for over a month. That's when they finally found Langley. He had been there the whole time, crushed under debris from one of his own traps that he accidentally set off. The trap had pinned the 61-year-old to the floor, suffocating him. Without his care, Homer had wasted away, paralyzed and blind, unable to help himself in any way. Told you it was sad. Alright, now this is easily the most stupid death on the list, pretty much because it was well-deserved and self-inflicted. Say hello to David Grundman. Hey there, he's an idiot. Hey. Now say hello to this, a saguaro cactus. Hi. They're the type of cactus you think of when you think of a cactus with its stereotypical cactus shape. Look how cactusy it looks. Now that's a cactus. So when it comes to David Grundman, there's not really much known about the guy. Why would there be? He wasn't famous, wealthy, notorious, or otherwise notable. He was just some dude who made a bad choice. Sorry, David, but it's true. In 1982, a 27-year-old David and his roommate James decided to have themselves an exciting day. Now, when you live in the middle of the blistering balls hot region of Satan's asshole, Arizona, you gotta get creative. So David and James carted themselves into the desert for some rootin' tootin' recreational shooting. Problem is, there's nothing too exciting to shoot at in the goddamn desert. Well, almost nothing. You got some snakes, deer, sheep, and a big old bug, but they mostly required permits and such. So instead of blowing out the brains of various animals, the two fellas decided to take their aggressions out on a particularly vertical saguaro cactus. Now, if you're unaware, these bad boys are huge, much larger than you'd imagine a cactus to be. Saguaro cactuses have been known to grow as high as 80 feet. That's like at least 3 meters or whatever. And if you see one with multiple arms, it's highly likely that that cactus is well over 100 years old. At their peak, a single full-grown saguaro cactus can weigh nearly 5,000 pounds or 2,300 kilos. With that in mind, David and James sought to cut a particularly girthy cactus down to size. In lieu of an axe, however, they opted to cut the cactus down the way our founding fathers intended, with a firearm. Lifting his shotgun, David did a trial run, first taking out a juvenile cactus. After sticking it to the little prickle, David took aim at a much larger target, a 27-foot tall tower of spines. But instead of blowing through the junk in its trunk, he pointed his weapon at one of its many branches. Guess he wanted to disarm it first. Well, he would end up being successful in that venture. Yeah, a little too successful. According to reports, David's shotgun slugs managed to blow off one of the cactus's arms. The arm, reportedly weighing nearly 500 pounds itself, fell several feet and landed right on top of David, crushing the man in a sudden catastrophic death. The point here is, don't mess with a cactus. It's not the sharpest idea, and you just end up looking like a prick. Stupid deadly trends in history. So social trends are a thing. Whether it's collecting the latest useless collectible or partaking in the how many dehydrated baby carrots can you shove into your butthole challenge, there's no avenue that humanity won't venture in order to fulfill our lives with something to ooh and ah at. And it's been that way since the dawn of man. Take, for instance, flagpole sitting. It's exactly as boring as it sounds, but for the dopamine-deprived people of yore, this was the bee's knees. The practice of posteriors perpetually planted on pillars and poles was prevalent as far back as the 5th century. Back then, a bunch of Christian dudes called stylites would make it their mission to live atop tall pillars, with the term stylites deriving from the Greek stylos, quite literally meaning pillar or column. Now, this wasn't for social entertainment, but rather for the salvation of their soul. Perhaps history's most well-known stylite was Simeon the Stylite. He believed that by living all uncomfy and uncozy atop his tall little pillar palace in Syria, with minimal sustenance and constant exposure to the elements, he would essentially cast away his mortal self. All that remains would be his immortal soul, ready for a first-class ticket to the heavens beyond. Because I guess God loves watching his creations mercilessly punish themselves for good boy points. According to some historical sources, Simeon remained perched on his pillar for as long as 42 years until his death. A real commitment to the bit. Fast forward tens of billions of seconds into the future, and the practice of pole sitting made a comeback in the 1920s and 30s in the United States. Only this time, it was to draw a crowd. Like any trend, it all began with one person. This person, semi-professional stuntman Alvin Kelly. Reportedly the result of a friendly dare, Kelly's first publicized climb was in 1924, where he sat for several hours outside a department store in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Excuse me, what's with that guy up there? Buy a coat, buy some slacks, don't forget to buy a hat. He's no one. Welcome to the story, enjoy yourself. Hey, come on, get down from there. No, I'm not gonna ask again. Ooh, what are you gonna do? Come up here and make me? Yeah, that's what I thought. Hey, guess what? What? Kelly's successful marketing campaign actually bloomed into a career. He would use his questionable talent to promote things like movie premieres or sporting events, but eventually became the main spectacle himself, touring 28 cities across the country where people actually bought tickets to watch dudes sit atop a pole for hours on end. Do a flip. His personal best was a cheek-numbing 49 days in Atlantic City, New Jersey. All of this fame and attention paved the way for others to take up the trend, from amateur backyard enthusiasts like Little Lenny here to full-time professional pole sitters like your mom. But of course, nothing lasts forever. The fad began dying out when several people started to die off thanks to that great big depression that happened in the 1930s. It's hard to laugh at someone struggling and starving on a pole 200 feet in the air when you're struggling and starving at ground level. By its very nature, the stunt of pole sitting was extremely dangerous. You had to balance yourself properly through sleep deprivation, harsh weather, and lack of nutrition. One slip or overcorrection was enough to convert all of your potential energy into kinetic energy as you gave onlookers a direct demonstration of gravitational acceleration.
Well, there he goes.
There was at least one verifiable death directly related to the act. Granted, this was decades later in the 1970s. The unlucky fella who took the fall was 72-year-old professional poler Richard Blandy. Dear old Dick spent a record-breaking 125 days atop a pole in Stockholm, Sweden just 9 years prior, surviving mostly on whiskey and 3 packs of cigarettes a day, or as I like to call it, the stepdad special. Then things hit a wall for Richard, or in this case, the ground. In 1974, while finishing up a 4-day promotional sitting at Dixie Square Mall in Harvey, Illinois, a trailer accidentally reversed into his tower, causing it to collapse and Richard to plummet to his death. Remember, the higher the heights you reach, the longer the fall from the top. Despite the fancy-sounding name, you're probably familiar with this one. Venetian ceruse was a specific type of cosmetic concoction used throughout the 16th century in Europe. The main purpose of this product was to lighten the complexion of many a fine fella or fellette. It also served to cover up blemishes and give a refined, flawless look. Since most of my guys are drawn as white as a cheese and mayonnaise sandwich, we need to travel back in time. Believe it or not, the desire to appear pale as paste actually stretches as far back as 2000 BC with the ancient Egyptians. Well, the rich ones anyway. You see, getting all tanned and toned under the hot sun all day was a sign that you were a filthy, hard-working poor. Not wanting to look like they partook in any labor, Egyptian nobles slapped lead-based powder all over their faces to get that DoorDash enthusiast look. You know, the look of royalty. The desire for a paler complexion traveled across the Mediterranean into ancient Greek territory where, again, upper-class folks took it upon themselves to whiten their skin and cover up any skin imperfections. The trend continued on to influence ancient Rome and even ancient China, all of which stuck to the lead-based recipe. Jump into the futuristic years of the 16th century, and the beauty standard still remained, and that's about the time that Phoenician ceruse entered the fray. Perhaps one of the most notable historical figures that dabbled in the dust was Queen Elizabeth I of England. The exact cause of her death is debated, but historians speculate her kicking of the royal bucket to have been a severe blood infection brought on by heavy use of her lead-based Phoenician ceruse makeup. She not only used the powder to minimize any melanistic manifestations, but to cover up severe scarring from her smallpox. It also was just the fashion at the time. If you take a look at a lot of Renaissance paintings from the era, you're gonna see a lot of disturbingly white faces. It was the epitome of beauty. I mean, nowadays some people obsess over looking like dumbass balloon animals, so it's not all that outlandish. The most well-documented death directly from Venetian ceruse use was debatably beautiful babe Countess Maria Coventry. Her heavy use of the stuff caused her own skin to crack and peel, forming painful open sores that she just covered up with more makeup. She bit the dust in 1760 at the age of just 27. So what exactly was it made of and why was it so toxic? Well, first of all, it's lead. Lead's not good for you, especially not being plastered onto your skin for hours or days on end. But lead isn't even white, I hear you scream into your screen. But white lead is. This is white lead. See how white it is? Pretty freaking white. This is hydroceracite, a lead salt compound also called lead carbonate hydroxide. It's naturally occurring, usually found alongside the pure lead deposits, so some Venetian fellas in Venice decided to mine the stuff, mash it up, and mix it with water and vinegar to create a paste. It was found to have incredible drying properties, so it was actually first used in the 16th century as a medical product, being applied to icky, sticky, oozing open sores and wounds to suck up the juices. But then I guess someone got a little experimental and realized it could be a great cosmetic as well.
Would you frig me? I'd frig me.
The problem though with long-term lead exposure is that it sort of leaches through the skin and into your blood, causing lead poisoning, and any condition with the word poisoning in it naturally doesn't have pretty side effects. According to the World Health Organization, severe lead poisoning can cause a wide variety of symptoms. None of them pleasant. You have your basic nausea and vomiting, sure, but you also have crippling headaches, memory loss, the big sad, and even high blood pressure in the short term. As for the long term, we're talking reproductive issues and even permanent brain and nervous system damage. The neurological effects often led to increased aggression, hyperactivity, and the lowering of one's IQ. So in scientific conclusion, heavy lead makeup was creating a bunch of irritated, angry, infertile morons. Just like those dang
Insert political party here.
am I right? Humans have been nodding their noggins and tapping their toes ever since first discovering a beat. And the act of rocking out usually lasts for several songs, which is normal, but how would you feel about dancing for days on end? Well, it happened. Dance marathons were all the rage back in the 1920s in the United States, but Americans actually have the British to thank for that. In February of 1923, professional dance couple Ollie and Edgar took it upon themselves to cut a British rug for 7 hours straight. This was something that, historically speaking, had never really been done before, and it caught some national attention. But in true American fashion, the British were about to be one-upped. Alma Cummings, a New York dance instructor who became fascinated with the idea of testing human limits while revolutionizing human expression, set a blistering 27-hour dance record just 12 days after the Brits tried to be good at something. I mean, look at that, she put holes in her soles, for God's sake. Something was happening within the United States in the 1920s. If you recall, the flagpole sitting craze was also hitting its stride at this point in time. Americans became obsessed with record-breaking feats of human physical endurance. So publicity stunts became the norm as normal humans tried pulling off superhuman endeavors. I'm gonna lift this car. So after Alma busted her move, the idea of endurance dancing began to take off. Within the next few weeks, her record had been broken 9 times across the country, so everyone was getting into the swing of things. It became a public spectacle, with promoters hosting dancing marathons as a form of entertainment. Pay a 25-cent fee, and you could just watch people shimmy 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 to the break of dawn. Several dawns, actually. You see, it didn't take long for the craze to drop a ranked mode. Competitive dancing marathons saw couples boogieing for days on end to get a chance at solid cash prizes. Those prizes became even more valuable once the world entered the Great Depression in the 1930s. In a collapsed economy, these marathons were seen not only as a form of entertainment for the now destitute masses, but a means of survival. That's because participants were properly fed and sheltered in exchange for their performance, all while still having that chance at a grand prize. These prizes could range from a couple hundred to a couple $1,000. Now, considering that the median income in the 1930s was roughly $1,000 a year, this was a big deal. So dancing devolved from entertainment to desperation. Competitors were allowed only short breaks in between numbers to catch their breaths, but they were still required to move and groove in some form, be it a tap of the foot or a nod of the head. Couples that stayed still for too long were actually prodded with sticks or splashed with water to get them back on their feet again, lest they be disqualified and thrown to the streets. The most famous dance champions of the age were handsome stud muffin Callum de Villiers and beautiful babe Vonnie Kuczynski. So take a guess. How long do you think that their record-breaking dance lasted for? Time's up. The answer was a heel-evaporating 157 consecutive days. Over 5 months of throwing down on the dance floor. Their prize? $1,000. Almost $25,000 in today's money. To no surprise, these endurance events were not without consequence. Like I said, people fully exhausted themselves to the point of collapse. Staying in the contest meant that you had food, water, and shelter for as long as you kept shaking that thing. And unfortunately, this resulted in a few reported deaths across the nation, one of the first being 27-year-old Homer Morehouse. No, not this guy. What, you want to see an actual picture of a dude who danced himself to death? You sicken me. Just an amateur dancer, Homer had reportedly been throwing it back for 87 hours straight, suffering from malnutrition and extreme sleep deprivation. He stumbled to a chair to take a break and fell over dead. News of these deaths caused immediate nationwide banning of dance marathons when they realized that, albeit voluntary human torture, isn't all that humane. But when promoters were raking in tens of thousands of dollars per event, stacks of cold hard cash outweighed the stacks of cold hard bodies. Hold on to your piggies, cause this one's gonna cause some toes to curl. As a warning, there will be some gross feet pics somewhere in this section. Now if you'll forgive my attempt at Chinese pronunciation, we'll get right into it. The practice of foot binding, or chansu, dates all the way back to the Imperial China days, with scholars failing to fully agree on any one origin story. Some claim the practice to have existed in the 6th century, but most point towards the 10th century under the Tang Dynasty. It is believed that a concubine of unsurpassed beauty was the first to bind her feet, though of course, not by choice. Lumpy Dumpling Emperor Li Yu commanded the aforementioned concubine Yao Nyang to wrap her feet in white silk to resemble the crescent moon. She then performed a fancy dance atop a golden lotus statue. The emperor stood in awe at the grace and elegance of the woman's dance, so naturally other women of status wanted to imitate it. Women would force their feet into unnatural positions, with the goal of creating what were later referred to as lotus feet. You know, like the flower, small, delicate, and beautiful. The teeny tiny tootsies were reportedly highly desirable, as Chinese men thought that this shit was undeniably sexy. Now, some historians believe that the real reason was a bit more selfish. See, this is what a real lotus foot looks like underneath the shoe. Scrumptious, right? Now imagine trying to walk around on those things all day. The reality of it was that walking on permanently disfigured feet meant excruciating pain. This resulted in women walking very daintily and slow, if at all. It has been suggested that the act of binding, while convincing women that it was to attract suitable partners, was actually a form of control, with men limiting the mobility of their wives. This would, in a sense, bind them to their homes just as their feet were bound to their shoes. This forced these women into sedentary, boring lives with nothing more to do than menial labor such as weaving and tapestry to help with the household income. Alright, but just how crunched in were them things, you may be asking yourself? And the answer is pretty friggin' crunched. Ideally, the foot was to be no longer than 4 inches or 10 centimeters in length. Ironically, the whole process was no small feat. Over the course of several months or even years, the toes would be repeatedly broken and tightly tucked under the sole with the entire foot folded downward to achieve the desired effect. Unfortunately, it's a sad reality that innumerable Chinese women faced across the centuries. Well, no, actually, it wasn't just grown women, but young girls too. I'm talking as young as just 4 or 5 years old. Gotta fold and mold them feet while they're still growing. You ever go on the Living with the Land ride at Disney's Epcot and see the neat Mickey-shaped pumpkins growing? It's the same principle, but with human feet. The binding of youthful feet was not only practical from a physical standpoint, but a disciplinary one as well. It trained young girls to realize that life is pain, as well as the importance of abiding by societal rules and customs. This practice persisted from the 10th century all the way up to the 19th century. By then, it's estimated that nearly half of all Chinese women had their feet bound to some degree. If it wasn't obvious, all that cracking and crunching of the feet didn't exactly come with health benefits. The forced deformation commonly resulted in ulcerations, nasty sores resulting from the cracking open of skin, which were very difficult to treat properly. These led to deadly bacterial infections and gangrene, sometimes requiring the full amputation of the affected foot. Refuse to cut off one foot and you can end up 6 underground. Foot binding started to fall out of favor towards the beginning of the 20th century. By this time, mass-produced textiles began taking over, leaving the perpetually working from home women to be out of a job. So they finally put their foot down. After exhaustive women's rights campaigns, the Chinese government took a step in the right direction by formally banning binding in 1949. Now, when you've got something that's beyond repair, do you ever just make the decision to break it a bit more to give it that sense of finality? Maybe just hucking a busted light bulb into a garbage can to hear a satisfying shatter? I have a deep garbage can. Well, gosh damn it, they did the same thing to full-size locomotives back in the day. Yep, if you had yourself a free afternoon and some spare change, you could waddle your britches on down to an isolated part of the plains to witness yourself a genuine high-speed train crash. But why? Because it looked cool. Come on, I know that when you cruise on down the freeway and notice a wreck on the side of the road, you're gonna be whipping your big dumb head around to see the extent of the damage. We all do it, that's why we have traffic. But that curiosity and wonder is what drew crowds of tens of thousands of spectators throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s. The premise was simple. Beginning in 1895, railroad organizers figured out a way to profit off of decommissioning their equipment. Train engines deemed obsolete either by being outdated or having otherwise unrepairable mechanical issues were placed on a long stretch of track facing each other. Onboard engineers would then set the locomotives full steam ahead before abandoning ship.
Step on the gas!
Allowing them to become a physical demonstration of physics. Spectators happily tossed a few of their hard-earned bucks to witness such a staged catastrophe. They were about as excited as a Second Amendment enthusiast experiencing his first home invasion. The problem, though, is that public safety measures at the time weren't much more than just standing back a ways while the trains did their thing. Nowadays, it's common for crowds to gather at scheduled demolition sites to watch tall buildings no longer be tall. But even at a bare minimum, safety nets are placed in front of the crowds to catch any rogue debris. Think about it, even a small stone zooming on through at hundreds of miles an hour can mean instant death. Well, that would have been a welcomed consideration in 1896. Just north of Waco, Texas, was the now infamous Crash at Crush, a staged train wreck that was more than what the crowd had bargained for. The planned crash was to occur at the town of Crush. Crash at Crush. Make sense now? The temporary town was built specifically for the event, with an expected crowd of 20,000 Texans. But thanks to effective advertising, 40,000 showed up, eagerly awaiting to see themselves a tasty train wreck. Now this should have been an omen that things weren't going to go as planned, but double the crowd meant double the doubloons and the pantaloons, so the event stuck to schedule. The two trains were put in place and sent on their way, topping out speeds at 50 miles an hour. The steam engines collided, as expected, but upon impact, the boilers violently exploded. Not as expected. The explosion launched shrapnel in every direction, which naturally included where the crowd was standing.
Well, butter my buns and call me a biscuit. I don't think that was supposed to happen.
You know what? I think you're right. In addition to dozens of Southern fellas sustaining some bumps and bruises from flying hunks of metal, at least 2 Texans unfortunately yeed their last haw. But surprisingly, the crowd didn't flee. Instead, they ran towards the wreckage to assess the damage and grab themselves a souvenir from the pile of twisted metal. After all, they did pay to see a wreck, so they were gonna get their money's worth. Despite the widespread report of the tragedy, the public didn't seem to care. In fact, these stunts only got more and more popular. Events kept chugging along well into the 1930s when the trend finally crashed and burned.
What better accomplishment can there be than living for eternity? Seeing civilization thrive, endless investing, watching your loved ones slowly decay around you? Yeah, immortality seems pretty great, and a lot of people throughout history thought so too. They spend years of their temporary stay on Earth attempting to make it a little bit more permanent. So let's take a look at how people have attempted to extend their normal lifespan. When you think of mummies, the first thing that probably comes to mind is ancient Egypt, where pharaohs were often mummified after their deaths, preserving their remains well beyond their normal decaying timeline. But what if they began mummifying themselves while they were alive? Well, that's what a small sect of Japanese Buddhism used to practice. Motivations for doing so can vary from selfless acts of sacrifice to protect others, or just to achieve spiritual ascension and be worshipped for all eternity. Those brave enough to take on the process, known as Soku Shimbutsu, start off by quite literally eating trees. The diet, called mokujiki, or tree eating, limited practitioners to nutritional staples such as nuts, berries, tree bark, and even tree resin. Just deep throat an entire cherry blossom down to the roots and call it a day. After 2,000 days of the strict diet, the monk would be encased in a tomb with holes poked in it for air like they were a pet hamster about to be absolutely manhandled by a toddler. They were also supplied with a bell which they would ring daily to tell everyone, nope, still not a mummy yet. They would spend their days reciting prayers and munching on their tree skits, slowly taking on the form of a hearty beef jerky. Once the bell stopped ringing, it was showtime. The tomb would be completely sealed for 1,000 days just to be extra sure things would go right. Afterward, the tomb would be opened to see if the monk was successful or not. At worst, they rotted away into a neighborhood favorite Halloween prop. And at best, they gained the ability to give Link cool Sheikah Slate upgrades. Since blood is the life fluid that we all have pumping around our big hulking meat sacks, why not frequently change it out like you would your car's oil? Surely it needs to be refreshed every once in a while. Out with the old, in with the new. That was Soviet physician Alexander Bogdanov's theory anyway. He saw blood transfusion as a therapeutic stimulant and wanted to test out its benefits firsthand. After abandoning politics in 1924 because Soviet Russia's communism wasn't communisming enough, Alex finally had the time to get around to some good old blood swapping. He took a deep dive into blood experimentation in hopes of unlocking eternal youth, or at least extending the normal human lifespan. Blood transfusions nowadays are one-sided. A needy patient receives blood from a healthy donor, and that's that. Alex, on the other hand, treated blood transfusions as more of an equivalent exchange versus a one-way donation. Two willing participants would trade out about a liter of blood to each other. The theory was that the participants would inherit each other's strengths. An older person would inherit youth from a younger partner, who would in turn get a +5 on all future wisdom rolls.
Hey bro, you wanna swap blood?
Well, what can you deadlift?
400 pounds.
Sold. Bogdanov himself participated in 11 of his own transfusion experiments. After receiving the blood, he noted how he felt rejuvenated, regained eyesight, slowed his baldness, and increased his daily rub-out limit to 3. It looked like Bogdanov was well on his way to attaining immortality. But like the story of Icarus, he just couldn't push that boulder up the mountain. Or something. I don't read Greek mythology. After his 12th transfusion with a less than ideal partner who may or may not have been infected with malaria and tuberculosis, he somehow became very sick and died in 1928. No, this isn't slamming down several cold ones while in a Lamb of God wall of death. Instead, we will take a trip back to Imperial China when the first emperor reigned. Qin Shi Huang declared himself emperor of unified China once he thoroughly convinced the other 6 Chinese states to bend to his will. Hey guys, you want to become a unified China? No, we're good. I think I'm fine. No, maybe later? Okay. How about now? Yay! As a bonus, his military strengths translated well into leadership qualities. Under his rule, he standardized many aspects of normal life. Currency, units of measurement, language, and laws were now universal across a unified China. He created networks of new roads, canals, and irrigation systems, allowing trade to flourish. In order to protect his new kingdom like a proud dad, he tied his New Balances tight and ordered the construction of a great big beautiful defensive wall that would be admired for millennia. After all, he made the bold claim that his kingdom would reign for more than 10,000 generations after him. Now, while Huang sounds pretty neat, he was a bit of a dick. He taxed the balls off of poor people, had historic and cultural documents burned, and executed anyone who went against his ideas. In doing so, he became isolated and hated. He was also completely bonked out of his gourd, lusting for eternal power and life, sending alchemists away on expeditions in search of the legendary elixir of life, even sometimes joining their journeys himself. His alchemical friends would frequently offer him potions and concoctions with the promise that they would at least extend his health bar a little bit while they searched for the elixir. Problem was, these potions contained mercury, a highly toxic liquid metal. But let's be honest, if you handed someone who is desperate for eternal life a bottle of stuff that looks like this, they're gonna go, "Oh, hell yeah!" and toss it back faster than you can say, "Wait, don't drink that." Emperor Qin Shi Huang died at the ripe old age of 49, a few infinities short of his goal. Oh, and his empire collapsed a few years later. No! If you've ever wanted to treat your body like some bad leftovers, then look no further than cryonics, the scientific technique of freezing your body in extremely low temperatures. Don't you mean cryogenics, I hear you ask? No, cryogenics is just the process of producing low temperatures. This is cryonics. Anyway, the theory is that you freeze your body and brain in temperatures low enough to halt all deterioration. The hope is that one day you can be thawed out and just resume your life as if nothing ever happened. There was a guy born in Belgium in 1930 by the name of this, who was a bit of a visionary. He would often speculate on how humans would innovate technology as time went on, being able to eventually solve any problem, including death. He also thought that modern politics were wasteful and outdated, that the only people who really exist are those who look to the future for change, or those who stay in the past and cling to tradition. Speaking of tradition, he also believed that traditional names were stupid. So he changed his own to FM 2030, much easier to pronounce. Besides sounding like a child of Elon Musk, FM's name change highlighted his goal of celebrating his 100th birthday in the year 2030. He believed that by then, humanity will be ageless, everyone will have an opportunity to live forever, and world peace will finally be attained. Good one. Unfortunately for him, his pancreas clung to the tradition of failing, and so he died in 2000 at the age of nice. To keep his dream alive now that everything else was dead, his remains were placed in a cryonic suspension in Arizona by the Alcor Life Extension Foundation, where they still exist today. Of course, it has to be said that there's no existing scientific evidence to suggest that cryopreservation can even be successful. The practice is often regarded as pseudoscience and a scam. Since clients are required to be legally dead and slammed full of antifreeze, it's impossible to resuscitate them. Like FM, hundreds of people have either had their remains cryopreserved or have made arrangements to do so after death. Even American superstar Jeffrey Epstein wanted his head and wiener frozen for future mischief, but we all know how that turned out. The gamble here is if the companies performing the storage will even be in business long enough to carry out their end of the bargain. Cryopreservation has been a thing since the 60s and 70s, but most of those companies went bankrupt, so their inventory of bodies were gently thawed and respectfully disposed of. Dr. Charles Brown Sequard was highly regarded by his peers in the medical community. He was a pioneer of sensory experiments on the spinal cord, as well as in-depth studies on the nervous system. But he was a bit off in some ways. He often performed radical experiments on himself, which would raise questions about his sanity. For example, when trying to figure out the cure for cholera, he wanted to determine how the disease was spread. When observing a cholera patient violently vomiting, he decided to catch the vomit in his own mouth and swallowed it. As is typical with aging, Charles found himself losing strength and stamina by age 72. Well, he took that personally and tried to find a way to regain his youth. After countless animal experimentations, he came up with a serum. One made from crushed up dog and guinea pig testicles mixed with blood. He injected himself with this serum and noted how he was able to lift heavier weight and even his pee stream was stronger, which is a pretty great benchmark to measure improvement. When presenting his findings to his colleagues, they were all,
Are you serious, dude?
His reputation was thrown into the toilet and he quickly became a laughingstock of the medical community. Looking back, it is likely that the serum that Charles injected contained a small amount of testosterone, which is why he experienced some positive results. Even though he was dismissed by his peers, he still offered the therapy to aging men wishing to regain and retain youth. Thousands of men were reported to have tried the serum, with some claiming the same effect as Charles, though it is now likely to have simply been a placebo effect. Charles died 4 years later at age 76.
Well, that was quite the entrance you've made, but you couldn't have picked a worse time to fall out of the sky. Looks like you've landed in Salem, Massachusetts. You know, the place with all of the witches and whatnot? Yeah, that one. Now don't be fooled. It may seem like a simple, peaceful, and wholesome village. Tread carefully, because one wrong move could have you swinging from a rope. So, do you think you could survive this Puritan hellhole? Let's find out. Welcome to Salem, Massachusetts. Founded in 1626, the settlement of Salem quickly established itself as a bastion for English Puritans. They were a group of religious nutjobs who sailed over from across the pond after facing religious persecution. Basically, their religion was a tad too crazy, even for the Church of England. You see, Puritans wholly believed that they were God's chosen few, that only they would be allowed through the cloud-covered pearly gates and everyone else could kick rocks. In hell. They also believed that Big Red Spirit Halloween Satan himself roamed the earth, wreaking havoc as a full-time job. Anything odd or inexplicable was the devil's doing, and any acts of the devil were met with swift punishment. Excuse me, what are you doing? Oh, just having a whistle. Oh. Not in this village, you're not. Pardon me, what are you doing? Oh, for fuck. Being a Puritan society, religious figures were the ones that ruled, and the biblical texts were the rules. Whatever the book says goes, with no room for improvisation. The church itself controlled everything, from the way you walked to the way you talked, from how you were dressed to what you'd ingest. But the church often stressed how you should feel blessed, so if you've ever felt repressed, you must confess or be placed under arrest. Gotta love a concentrated society of religious fanatics. What could go wrong? Right? Fast forward several decades, and here we are in a cold January in 1692, the start of a new year for the town. Well, you've got to get to fitting in, so best introduce yourself.
Good morrow.
Hello.
Pardon?
Bad move. The word hello won't be used as a greeting for another 100 years.
Thou art not from around hither, art thou?
No?
Methought so.
Try again.
Good morrow.
Good morrow. That's better. Remember, the great thing about a small village like this is that everyone knows each other. The worst thing is that everyone knows each other. But it looks like you're about to run into someone familiar? Dude! Ron? Is that you?
Yes, sir.
Where the hell did you come from?
Well, I saw this cool little green portal thingy and jumped right on through. Heck of a ride. Wouldn't do it again, though. It inverted my belly button and made me piss myself. Anyway, look who I found.
Who's that?
This loose slab of butter right here is my great something or other Uncle Jimothy, Salem's finest blacksmith, so I've been told.
Oi, how'd you figure that out?
Well, I asked him. Anyways, where were we?
I think we were just talking about... The hell was that?
Let's check it out.
Oh boy, the two girls pitching a fit on the ground are none other than 12-year-old Abigail Williams and 9-year-old Betty Paris. Their actions are about to set forth quite a series of unfortunate events, and they won't even star Jim Carrey. Looks like this calls for a doctor's opinion. Aye, this be a case of witchcraft.
No way.
If there's one place you don't want to be in this world, it's being in the middle of a religion-obsessed community that's been given the news that the devil himself may be walking amongst them. The news of the girl's possible bewitchment set the entire village of Salem completely on edge. Despite a solid month of good old homemade remedies like fasting, burning herbs, jorking crystals, or that iconic prayer mumbo-jumbo, nothing seemed to work. Were the girls just joshing? Or was something more malevolent lurking in the shadows? Samuel Paris, the town's minister and father to Itty Bitty Betty, was desperate for answers. Finally, someone offered a more creative approach. Entering stage left is Samuel's neighbor, Mary Sibley. Entering stage right are Sam Paris's personal servants, John Indian and Tituba.
They're slaves.
Together, the three concocted a plan to fight fire with fire. Since desperate times call for desperate measures, this brought the concept of counter magic to the table. Although a potential solution, however a bunch of baloney it may be, the act of performing counter magic was just as offensive in the eyes of Puritans as black magic, and just as dangerous.
Shoo-ba-da-boo!
But what are you gonna do? Just let your daughter or niece scream and flail about on the ground like they were told no at a toy store? Didn't think so. So, Reverend Paris did what he had to do. The proposed solution? Just bake a cake. Now, it's easy to bake a pretty cake, but you gotta do the cooking by the book. And this is the book. So, this is the cake. Made from a mix of rye flour and, I shit you not, a cup of the afflicted's own urine, this disgusting dessert was then offered to the Paris' dog as a way to ward off these sinister symptoms and, in turn, cause physical harm to the witch responsible for casting the curse. Shockingly, it didn't work. And to make matters worse, 2 more young girls were getting down with the sickness. The girls claimed that they were being constantly tormented by evil spirits, but none of the other villagers ever witnessed these supposed spooky specters.
My sweet spazzing children, who did this to you?
Oh, hell no!
The girls named 3 women as witches: Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne. The 3 were arrested and brought before a court to confess their crimes. Both Sarahs maintained their innocence, but Tituba caved. She confessed that she, along with Sarah 1 and Sarah 2, were wicked witches. Now, why in the frickin' heck would she do this, you might ask, scratching your itchy kneecaps? Because Sam Paris, her master, told her to. After being formally accused, Tituba was threatened to admit guilt or be smash KO'd off screen with 0 stock. So which do you choose? Death at the hands of a single man, or by a jury of your peers? She chose the latter. But to throw a wrench into things, Tituba offered one more tidbit of information. There were more witches in the village. She just didn't know who. It could be anybody. Little Anne could have an evil plan, Big James could be casting flames, could it be Johnny with his golden fiddle, or Tom whose last name is Riddle? No one knew, and that was the problem. In one fell swoop, Tituba used history's greatest weapon: fear. And this wasn't just the run up my basement steps really fast so the demons don't get me type of fear. This was full-blown paranoia. And paranoia is an unlubed shaft just aching to cause some damage. Fear was at an all-time high, and trust was at an all-time low. With neighbors now turning on each other at the slightest inconvenience, this led to an overwhelming increase in accusations. So let's take a look at what it took to be accused of witchcraft. When paranoia goes full tilt, no one is safe. No man, woman, child, or even the village dog is free from suspicion. Between February of 1692 and May of 1693, it's believed that over 200 people in and around Salem were accused of witchcraft. The main character in a lot of these allegations was 12-year-old Ann Putnam Jr., who was personally responsible for putting over 60 innocent people on trial, some of whom were executed. But you didn't have to be caught red-handed smearing toad blood in a pentagram of candles to be considered an evil witch. Even simple, everyday tasks or coincidences were viewed as the devil's work to a bunch of cuckoo crazy people. If you found yourself strong enough to lift a heavy gun, it's cause the devil helped you, so now your days are done. If you can kill off crops with just a single glance, there's not much I can say. You don't stand a chance. If you brewed a bit of food that a rude dude chewed and subsequently spewed, your years of life accrued were about to conclude. Even petting a black cat without giving a dang, each one of these reasons was enough for you to hang. Now, if you think that these were just dope rhymes with no reason, you're wrong. These were very real claims by the people of Salem. George Burroughs, one of Salem's ex-ministers, was a beefy boy. He lifted a really heavy musket when no one else could. Very impressive, but a bit too impressive. He was tried and executed. Martha Carrier faced the gallows after apparently hexing and killing a neighbor's entire livestock by just looking at them. It was pure mayhem. But not everyone agreed with what was going on. Luckily, some sound-minded villagers were not buying the bullshit, and many protested the imprisonment of obviously innocent people. Unluckily, those who called the trials a bunch of baloney were also thrown in the clink.
This is a bunch of baloney. This ain't witchcraft.
Ron? Oh no, looks like Ron's about to face a fate worse than death. The legal system. Well, time for a trial. Here we are, the trials of the century. Well, I guess multiple centuries since we're still talking about them. News of witchcraft allegations reached far and wide, prompting intervention from the Massachusetts government to sort it all out. Thus, the Salem witch trials commenced, fancy powdered wigs and all. You know, English things. Thankfully, since the trials happened only a few hundred years ago, there's still lots of surviving documents from Salem. Lots of them. So we can still get a pretty clear picture of how everything went down, or at least the version that was written. The court structure was very similar to what it is today. A judge, a jury, witnesses, testimonies, all that. But sprinkling in the complete paranoia that infested the village, things got interesting. The main accusers, the teenage girls Abigail Williams and Ann Putnam Jr., were present at pretty much every trial, much to the dismay of anyone whom they accused. If the defendants gave any attempt at denying the allegations, then the show would start. For poor Bridget Bishop, the girls claimed that they were being tortured by her evil spooky ghost. The girls would break out into fits and convincing seizures in court to make it seem like Bishop was cursing them from afar, like a witch would.
That's not how that works.
Bridget Bishop was convicted and hanged on June 10, 1692. Miss Martha Corey's testimony saw some real creativity. After publicly calling out the girls on their bullshit, Martha put herself in the crosshairs and was forced to defend her own innocence in court shortly after. While giving her testimony, the girls began to mimic her movements. When Martha raised her hand, so did the girls. If she turned her head, they followed. The girls cried out, claiming that they were being puppeted by the devil, and Martha was the one pulling the strings.
Art thou fucking serious?
72-year-old Martha Corey was convicted and hanged on September 22nd, 1692. Martha's husband, Giles, is probably the most famous death of these Salem witch trials. But the guy was a certified asshole, having turned on his own wife after she was accused, ultimately testifying against her and giving examples of her witchcraft, like reading too much or nagging him too often. He did later attempt to rescind these allegations, but it was a bit too late as she was already doomed to hang. Now, with Giles being on trial himself, he refused to plead guilty or not guilty. He knew that regardless of his plea, he would still end up being converted to a human wind chime. Boy, was he wrong. Instead, he was given more pressing matters. Literally. As punishment for his supposed crimes, Giles was forced to endure peine forte Dieu. That's French for strong and hard pain. What this meant was being laid on the ground under a board. Big, beautiful boulders were added to the board, distributing their weight across his body. Hundreds of pounds of stone pressed down on Corey across 3 whole days. His final words? More weight. He was 81, but now it looks like it's Ron's turn to defend himself. Let's see how that goes.
Ronald J. Fartknocker, thou hast been accused of witchcraft. What say you in your defense?
I didn't do shit.
He's innocent!
Huh? What's all this?
Your Honor, I've known Ron for years. We've been through so much together.
That's right. We sort of survived a whole nuclear apocalypse together. He knows what a real witch is. She's been using powerful magic to torment him for years, sending him all across time. Greece, Japan, Egypt, you name it.
It's true. Wait a minute. only ever told you about the nuclear apocalypse. How did you know about the others?
You just couldn't go along with it, could you? And here I thought you were a smart fella, not a fart smeller.
You're not Ron. You're...
No. Took you long enough.
That's a witch.
Well, we've never really burned a witch before, but we'll take your word for it.
Yeah. It'll work.
There's nothing more embarrassing than talking at a family dinner about your favorite historical subjects, only to be corrected by your sibling going, actually, Napoleon was above average height for his time. You contemplate what to do with the rest of your night since you just got absolutely destroyed. You quickly fact-check this verbal beatdown, but realize, oh my god, they were right. How could I have been so wrong? If you don't want this to be you, then listen up, because here's some historical facts that you're probably wrong about. Number 1, the majority of American colonists wanted independence from Great Britain. Since we know that history is written by the winners, it is often thought that the overwhelming majority of American colonists hated the filthy stinking redcoats, an attitude that served as the catalyst for the American Revolution. But that's not entirely true. Sure, there were revolutionaries, but in fact, the colonists who wanted revolution were never even in the majority. Less than 45% of American colonists wanted independence, while the other 55% were either rich loyalists who didn't really want to risk losing their comfy fish and chips way of life, or neutral fence sitters who were just along for the ride, throwing caution to the wind and living their simple peasant lives. Once the revolution did start, however, many loyalists either fled to Canada, cowards, or fought against their own people, only to lose horribly. Number 2, the Declaration of Independence was signed on the 4th of July, 1776. American Independence Day on the 4th of July is a time for Americans to let loose by relaxing by the pool, detonating explosives, and having 1 or 10 beers with friends, family, and whatever remaining fingers they have. Surely a day called Independence Day means that the Declaration of Independence was signed on that day, right? Not exactly. Independence from Britain was actually declared on July 2nd, but the head honchos at the time were like, oh, maybe we should write this down and make it official or something. So after 2 days of figuring out Microsoft Word, they came back with an actual declaration, which was officially adopted on the 4th of July. But since everyone was way too busy celebrating in their pools with some brewskis, it wasn't fully signed until August 2nd, 1776. Number 3, George Washington was the first president of the United States of America. Yeah, a lot of these were a little bit more United States themed than I thought, so I'm either biased or the rest of world history is pretty boring. Probably both. One of the first things American youngins are taught in school is how to lock a door and avoid gunfire. And also that George Washington was the first president. But guess what? Not true. Okay, technically he was the first president elected by the people, but there were several other rich white dudes who held the title of president before him. The first being John Hanson, with the title of President of the United States in Congress assembled. Although he only served for just 1 year, he did help structure the growing baby government we all know and know today. Number 4, Benjamin Franklin discovered electricity. Yeah, no, the concept of electricity was known, though not well understood, for thousands of years back when Egyptians were getting shocked by electric eels and not learning their lessons. The Greeks discovered the concept of static electricity as well by rubbing fur on amber and attracting a few light objects. Benjamin Franklin was chilling on his porch watching a storm when he pondered, that's probably that electricity stuff everyone keeps talking about. So, he got his handy-dandy, trusty, dusty kite to test his theory. He strapped a small metal key to the string to act as a conductor for the electricity. After the key gave him a small jolt, he was like, nice. So while he didn't discover electricity as a whole, he did prove that lightning was electrical. That's kind of cool too. Not being on the $100 bill cool, but cool. Number 5, people in New York threw themselves out of buildings during the 1929 stock market crash. Good times don't last forever, and the United States learned this very quickly when in 1929, the stock market saw the worst crash in history, dropping over 50% in value thanks to irresponsible consumer and bank behavior like predatory loans and purchasing on credit. Who does that? Billions of dollars were wiped out practically overnight. Now, when your wealth and living standard gets Thanos snapped out of existence, you might think that a quick leap and a hard drill into the pavement would solve your problem since you can't be poor if you're dead. Well, maybe some people did think that, but apparently no one's intrusive thoughts won because there was no reported uptick in self-unaliving in the wake of the stock market crash. It would actually be another 72 years before jumping from buildings became a short-lived fad in New York. Number 6. Germany invaded Russia in the winter during World War II. Finally made it out of the United States. Yeah, there's a common misconception that Germans decided to pull a pro-gamer move and invade their barren, tundra, wasteland ally Russia in the dead of winter, prompting the Germans to be like, "Fuck!" and turn back home. Not the case. Germans pushed into Russian territory on June 22nd, 1941, and actually made considerable progress on their way to Moscow, since Russia was not expecting such a top 10 anime betrayal. But tough territory challenges, low morale, and overall exhaustion caused German progress to slow down while new, fresh Russian troops were being spawned in. Once winter set in, things only got worse. Since Russia was hosting, Germans were susceptible to extreme lag and their ping was trash. Germans eventually were driven out of Russia after failing to defeat the Red Army. Number 7. Life expectancy in the Middle Ages was only in the 30s. This is a mathematical misconception here. You love math, right? Right. So the way an average lifespan is calculated is you take the ages across all people and divide by the number of people to get your average. Thing is, babies weren't really resilient. So when you start chucking a bunch of zeros and ones into the data pool, you get a strongly skewed average. In reality, it was common for people in the Middle Ages to live into their 50s and 60s.
I'm 37. What? I'm 37, I'm not old.
Leaving plenty of time for them to do fun things like farming and... So, if you made it to 25 in the Middle Ages, you were expected to live another 25 years on average. Sure, it's shorter than today's expected lifespan of 73 years, but hey, beggars can't be choosers. Number 8. Thomas Edison invented the light bulb. Although he is credited with inventions like the phonograph and absolutely terrifying talking nightmare dolls, you probably know Thomas Edison is most famous for inventing the light bulb. Well, that's a lie. Before Edison's design in 1879, electric lighting was used as far back as 1802 with the electric arc lamp. Operating under the same general principle as a light bulb today, the arc lamp generated an electric arc that would light up whatever room it was in. Problem was, these things were loud, expensive, inefficient, and funny enough, way too bright. The design went through multiple improvements in the following decades, making them much more practical for uses like street lamps or lighting large buildings. To his credit, Edison did improve the design further to allow light bulbs to last longer and be more practical in a household setting, but his light bulbs were not the first. Number 9. Cars were invented in the United States by Henry Ford. Well, look at Americans trying to take credit for things yet again. While Henry Ford never invented the automobile, he did revolutionize the mass production of them with the invention of the assembly line. Oh wait, he didn't invent that either. Ransom Olds of the Oldsmobile brand did. But Henry did take that model and improve upon it by making it a moving assembly line, dropping the assembly time of a single car from 12 hours to just 1.5. Oh yeah, and the first gas-powered automobile was invented by Carl Benz, one half of the famous Mercedes-Benz brand, back in 1886, 17 years before Ford's first car was produced. Also, it looks stupid. Number 10. You should subscribe to the channel. Oh wait, this one's true. How'd that get in there? Number 10-2. The Greeks tricked the Trojans with a giant wooden horse. Well, this one's a classic. We've all heard the story of the Trojan horse, proved that people used to pull off good pranks before cameras and ad revenue. The story goes that during the Trojan War in 1183 BC, sneaky Greekies wanted to gain the upper hand in sieging the city of Troy. In order to do so, they built a large wooden horse and left it at the city gate. The Trojans were like, huh, neat, a present. Don't mind if I do, ha ha ha, and wheeled it inside of the city. In the middle of the night, when the Trojans were honk-shoeing, Greek soldiers snuck out of the hollow wooden horse and slaughtered the Trojans, leading to the fall of Troy. Yeah, never happened. In fact, it's debated if the Trojan War itself even happened. The story about the Trojan War was written by the Greek poet Homer, who, funny enough, might not have even existed himself. Historians really need to get their act together because it's getting kinda hard to fact-check all of this. Well, there you go. Be sure to bring up whatever you learned today to your next family or friend gathering so they could be like, that's neat. Leading to a dead-end conversation where you just go back to scrolling through your phone. Oh boy, looks like the witch got you again. This time, you gracefully land in Independence, Missouri in the mid-1800s. Everyone's packing up and moving out west to seek their fortune in greener pastures, and you don't want to get left behind. Think you have what it takes to blaze the trail? Let's find out. Since you've just been thrown into this reality, you're only as good as the skills that you can provide. As we all know, there's only 3 kinds of people in this world: bankers, farmers, and carpenters. Nothing else. And thanks to good old democracy, you are now, a crafty carpenter. You enjoy getting hammered and occasionally nailed. You've got some solid survival stats and decent savings. Good choice. Not that it was yours anyway. Here's your complimentary wife and 2 adorable little cherubs to help you on the trail. Look how cute they are. Your mission is to travel down the soon-to-be famous Oregon Trail. Over 2,000 miserable miles of dirt, disease, and death, formally established in 1836 to help pioneers move out west. But why would I move out west, you might ask? Because you want to. But more importantly, the US government wants you to. Look, the eastern states are getting all congested, industrial, and smoggy. So the United States needs to do some good old expansion. Thanks to the Louisiana Purchase in 1803 and the Oregon Treaty in 1846, there's a lot of fresh open land to settle. Why live in the economic decline of disgusting cities in the east when you could manifest that destiny and fill up those lungs with fresh air on the fertile plains?
That's good air.
If the opportunity of prosperity wasn't enough to convince you, how does free land sound? Thanks to the Oregon Land Donation Claim Act of 1850, pioneers can claim up to 640 acres, 2.6 square kilometers, of land completely free. Time to get supplies. Look, if you're going to be slogging down a few thousand miles of rocky trail, you're going to need to be well supplied if you want to stand any chance of surviving. Pioneers stocked up their supplies in trailhead towns just like Independence, Missouri. Things like food, clothes, tools, livestock, and perhaps the most critical American asset, guns. Because when you're out on a seemingly endless sand ocean, anything's fair game. What's to stop a desperate thief from stealing your precious supplies and/or daughter? Your gun. So be sure that you're well equipped to donate a few lead slugs to their cause. And of course, you could also hunt for food if you need to. When it came to food, a family of 4 would need about 1,000 pounds of the stuff. This was usually beans, rice, flour, sugar, coffee, and dried meats and veggies. Don't forget your pots and pans and your fresh water barrel, or else you'll be washing down your salty deer jerky with a cup of dried rice. For tools, you're gonna need to be making repairs when stuff breaks, and stuff will break. Since you're a carpenter and know how to carpent properly, you're set with a hammer, a saw, and an axe. And of course, you'll need some spare clothes, otherwise you'll be walking around with some breezy cheeks. In order to haul all of your stuff down the trail, you're gonna need a big ol' wagon. This sucker right here is a prairie schooner. Not as beefy as the heavy Conestoga wagons used for shipping freight, but you can still fit so many supplies and family members in this bad boy. With 4 ox power, tricked out wooden wheels, and a non-existent suspension, the kids will be uncomfortably wobbling down a trail at a spine-shattering 15 miles per day. You and your wife, however, will be getting your steps in the entire way. Every day is leg day on the Oregon Trail. So with a modest $800 to your name, you talk to the general store owner and place your order.
Yes, sir. What can I do you for?
Well, about 20 bucks, but I'm kind of looking for some supplies.
Sure thing. Take a look around.
Yeah, can I get, So can I just get one of everything?
Yeah, I'll ring you up.
You better get used to that wagon, because you're about to spend about 6 months in it. You've got almost 2,200 miles of trail ahead of you. But you're not alone. In fact, over 400,000 other pioneers are also making the trek. Just don't make too many friends, because you'll end up burying some of them along the way. About 10% of those who hit the trail ended up really hitting the trail. For better survival stats, many families opted to form traveling caravan groups consisting of dozens of wagons to support each other. But having so many people around inevitably led to disagreement. Hey, can you pass the beans?
I don't know, can I?
The fuck's your problem? So in order to avoid descending into complete chaos, leaders and officers were elected to direct the caravans, laying out agreed upon ground rules dictating what to do in certain events. So if grandma slips and takes a wheeler 50 to the spine, we all know who gets all of her stuff. Enjoy those dentures. Proper planning gave you those. These concrete rules were designed to prevent arguments down the line. But, of course, humans will be humans.
I just wanted some beans.
But you're a simple fella who makes simple decisions, so you're probably fine, right? What could go wrong? Being on the road for about a month now, you've passed through a few forts and landmarks, and besides a few snakes and your son hucking some stuff off of the wagon for fun, things have been going pretty well. Huh. Well, time to put the carpenter skills to use and make repairs. While there's some downtime, the family has an opportunity to catch up on some chores. Just remember to keep your guard up and avoid any, Since your wagon conveniently broke down next to a freshwater spring, your wife is able to replenish the water supply before washing the farts out of your family's clothes. Meanwhile, your daughter feeds the oxen and your son laps up water from a brown puddle. Look at him go. Oh wait, that's not good. Your son is gonna quickly learn about a little thing called cholera. You see, there were plenty of diseases that plagued the dusty trail like mumps, measles, and the dreaded dysentery, but cholera was by far the worst. Contracted mainly from contaminated water sources where fellow pioneers expelled their evils, cholera could kill within hours and spread just as fast across an entire caravan. Symptoms included extreme nausea, vomiting out your front, vomiting out your back, dehydration from all the vomiting, leg cramps, restlessness, irregular heartbeat, glassy eyes, and perhaps the worst symptom of all, death. Oh my god, he's dead! No, he could just have cholera. Disease alone was the biggest killer on the trail, with estimates of over 30,000 deaths. So, best to avoid slurping down brown puddles. Sorry, son. Not only were diseases a guaranteed add to the death count, but so were injuries. Even something as simple as a small cut could easily be infected, with the extent of medical treatment being no more than, put some whiskey on it. Your prognosis wasn't too promising. So when little Jimothy falls off the wagon and shatters both tibias, he's now the trail's newest speed bump. If you were afflicted by something, the best you could do was rest. Resting was crucial for pioneers. If they didn't stop to rest frequently, they ended up taking a dirt nap from crippling exhaustion. But not only was physical health a concern, but mental health as well. There were quite a few reports of people throwing themselves off the wagon of life when their mental health deteriorated from not only the monotonous and seemingly unending voyage, but seeing the constant line of rotting bodies of fallen pioneers. It was pretty common to pass several dead travelers every day on the trail, so you gotta think that that's pretty demoralizing, especially if some of those travelers were your friends and family. Even today, some of these graves still mark the end of many pioneers' journeys. Mental health really was no joke. Take for example the famous story of Elizabeth Markham, who was pushed to the brink of insanity while on the trail. In the middle of their trek, she hit a point of exhaustion where she simply refused to travel any further, and nothing could convince her to carry on. After hours of failed encouragement, her husband and children were forced to abandon her and move on. After a while, her son was sent back to get her after she had rested. Bad move. Elizabeth eventually caught back up with the rest of the family, but left her son in the dirt with a rock lodged in his skull. When her husband raced back to find his son still barely alive, Elizabeth set fire to the family's wagon for good measure. Can't continue down the trail if everything you own is reduced to a cinder, can you? Not only were humans a danger to themselves, but so was almost everything else, especially nature. High winds, strong storms, blazing heat, freezing nights, they all did what they do best. They happened. You also had to watch out for wildlife. Wolves, bears, snakes, coyotes, and buffalo. They were all out to get you and your family. But thanks to firearms, humans were able to get them back, especially the buffalo. That's gonna piss off some Native Americans. Speaking of which, there's often a misconception that Native Americans were a constant threat. Not true. In fact, quite the opposite. Native outposts were extremely useful trading sites to replenish food and other supplies. Natives also served as experienced tour guides, escorting some pioneers through rougher terrain like forests and rivers. Granted, there were a few deadly altercations between pioneers and natives, usually a result of pioneers being paranoid and shooting at natives unprovoked. About 800 natives and pioneers were killed thanks to sheer stupidity. Oh well, the wagon's repaired, so time to get back to it. You continued traveling on for a few more months, passing by more forts and giant rocks, but things have been pretty quiet. Wait, why is everything so quiet? They're probably fine. You then break out of your reminiscing when something catches your eye in the distance. There it is! The end of the line and a ticket to a new life. Oregon City. That's in Oregon. All that's left between you and salvation is a huge freaking river. The Columbia River. You can't exactly cross it, so you're gonna need to ford it. You waterproof your wagon, but you still need a raft to hold everything. Oh, but building a sturdy enough raft is just gonna be impossible, is what a non-carpenter would say. It's river time. Embarrassing royal deaths.
At just 6 years old, itty-bitty Jimmy II of Scotland was an excited little prince eager to one day inherit the throne from his dear old dad, King James I. And it looks like that day is today.
Dad?
James I was a victim of a coup conducted by his power-hungry uncle who sought to seize the throne. His wife, the Queen, was injured but managed to survive despite being an intended target. Although certainly shaken, she stirred up quite the outcry from her Scottish subjects by putting her now very dead husband's corpse on display, and seeing the sheer brutality that had occurred, an all-out manhunt began for the men responsible. And these men were captured and brutally executed. With the old king gone, it was time to crown a new one. Being only 6 at the time of his dad's dastardly demise, Slimmy Jimmy Jr. was crowned on March 27, 1437. But since he couldn't make any sound decisions as a drooling youth, his still-alive mom took power as regent, acting as ruler on James's behalf. But therein lies the problem. See, the people of Scotland are what we call Scottish. The Queen, now ruling over Scotland, hailed from England. You see the problem here. She was promptly pushed from power in favor of someone a bit more Scottish.
Bursting through the door is Archibald Douglas.
He's the king's much older first cousin. He took the job but died a few years later from a fever since there wasn't a cowbell in sight. Power was then passed to these two fine fellows, Lord William Crichton and Sir Alexander Livingston. Their goal was to keep King James safe and in power, but in such a hostile political environment, with all of these seemingly random people trying to do their best to position themselves into more power, sometimes it takes a bit of violence to achieve those goals. The best example of said violence being the infamous Black Dinner. In 1440, Lord Crichton and Sir Livingston held a royal dinner at Edinburgh Castle, where the king resided. At the top of the invite list were 16-year-old William Douglas and his 10-year-old brother, David Douglas. They were the sons of former fever haver Archibald Douglas and a threat to the crown. While downing a hock of ham and a bushel of apples, or whatever they ate in those times, the brothers would soon learn that this dinner would come with a show. In the middle of the meal, a decapitated black bull's head was aggressively slammed onto the table in front of them. Ooh, dessert. Now, apparently having a black bull's bulbous block brutally bashed onto your beautiful buffet was a Scottish nobleman's friendly gesture of impending doom. Despite the young King James's pleas, the two boys were captured and beheaded right in front of him. Hardly appetizing. This historical power move was the direct inspiration for that red wedding scene in the Game of Thrones. Fast forward through a few years of childhood trauma to 1449, and the now 19-year-old James marries a nice lady named Mary, and she shoots out 7 kids. One of them dies. Very sad, but very typical. With his marriage and coming of age, James's kingship switched from free trial to premium access. However, what was left of those dang Douglases are still fighting to retain power. If only there was a way for a king to take care of such an annoyance. Yeah, that works. James eventually wiped the Douglases from power and yoinked their land, and he was now in full control of his kingdom. Despite looking super spooky with his villainous vermilion birthmark covering half of his face like that one Avatar guy, I don't know his name, I never watched it, James was a very successful king. He was super social with commoners and advocated for advances in education, helping found the University of Glasgow in 1451. James was also a huge proponent of modern war technology, which, at the time, happened to be war cannons. These engineering marvels of bronze and iron were critical in besieging forts and castles, as cannonballs would just chew right through them things. While attempting to capture Roxburgh Castle, one of the last Scottish castles still under smelly English control after the Scottish Independence Wars, King James II positioned himself next to one of his prized cannons, and after a few words of encouragement to his bombardment buddy, the king gave the order. Artillery! The mounted metal menace exploded, killing King James II instantly at the age of 29. This rather unfortunate death was cemented in Scottish lore on August 3rd, 1460, and is officially, well, canon. In the middle of the Capetian dynasty, the Kingdom of France was ruled by this guy, Louis VI, also known as Louis the Fat, which is just mean. He should be called Louis the Body Positive. Anyway, this big fat asshole had 8 kids, and this chapter is all about his eldest son, Philip.
call me Phil.
As was tradition in the Capetian dynasty to establish a clear lineage to the throne, young Philip was crowned as co-king of the Franks at the tender age of 13, right about the time when teen angst starts kicking in. Although reportedly Louis's favorite child, Philip was a bit of a stinker. He would refuse to listen to his father's authority, fail to pay attention to any of the king's lectures and set standards for being a king, and devolved into being a disobedient little shithead, as kids tend to be. According to Walter Mapp, a historic writer during that time period, the continued arrogance and insubordination of the spry little king made him, quote, a burden to all. You know, like when you see a small child convulsing on the floor of your local Target because a 36-year-old man-child snatched the last Pokemon Prismatic Evolutions booster pack out of their clammy little ham hands while the parent just looked on in a dead stare? Hang in there, man. Even though a troublesome youth, the problem would soon fix itself. In October of 1131, at age 15, young King Philip was chilling with the bros, racing through the streets on their one-horsepower tricked-out Mustangs, when everything was turned on its head. A small sable swine scuttled into the street, right in the path of the oncoming prince and his gang. Philip, who was leading the group, was catapulted off of his horse after it had tripped over the surprise pig. Prince Philip slammed into the ground in a devastating crack and crunch of bone, fracturing all of his limbs and being rendered unconscious. Tragically, the young king had succumbed to his wounds the very next day. King Louis and his family were stricken with immense grief over the loss of their son. The little piggy went to market, but it should have stayed home. George II, King of Great Britain, began life as a tiny little bratwurst in Hanover, Germany in 1683. His father, also George, was the first king of the Hanoverian era and a rather combative parent. Neither George liked the other and would always get into very heated and very public arguments over stuff like politics and other king things. But to be a little more specific, small George despised his dad's advisor, Robert Walpole, the guy considered to be the first British Prime Minister and the one who was really pulling all of the political strings behind the scenes. Think Wizard of Oz, but with a smaller head and worse teeth. But one day, enough was enough. Big George banished Little George from the king's palace after a falling out. The prince was pretty okay with this. He and his wife lived in peace and quiet for quite a few years until, well, the king died. Time to go be a king. Prince George achieved his kingship in 1727 at the age of 43. Views of his reign as king were mixed. Despite squashing political uprisings, expanding the arts, laying the foundations for the Industrial Revolution, and overseeing many successful military conflicts, including leading his troops into battle himself at the age of 60, his English subjects just couldn't get over the fact that he was German, so, you know, they were biased. Growing into his golden years, age started to really take a toll on the king. By 1760, King George II was 76, blind in one eye and hard of hearing. In the wee hours of October 25th, the rather fermented monarch rose from his bed, drank his iconic 6 a.m. hot chocolate, and excused himself to the loo to force out his own hot chocolate. But it was here on his cushy secondary throne that things took a turn for the worse. A servant stationed outside of the royal chambers heard a loud crash and comedically tore the door open to find the root of the commotion. What he found was the king on the floor, seemingly having just finished his business. George was lifted onto his bed and tended to by his physician, but his body crapped out on him. The king was dead. An autopsy of the royal remains indicated that the king had died as a result of a thoracic aortic dissection, the first reported case in history. See that tear right there in the aorta, the big artery leading into his artery? Yeah, that's not supposed to be there, but how it happened is the question. And it is believed that the blood pressure required to cause such a rupture on an old man's already weakened heart came from a rather forceful push of the pelvic floor muscles. So, in an attempt to relieve himself of his intestinal burden, the king relieved himself of this mortal coil. Remember to stay hydrated. In a time where kings were given rather displeasing titles such as the Terrible or the Bad or the Slobberer, Martin of Aragon was granted the title of Martin the Humane. The gracious nickname was a testament to his kind and caring nature. He basically earned it by being a bit less murdery than any other kings at the time. I mean, all the guy did was reconquer Sardinia, suppress revolts, and led crusades against the Moors in northern Africa. But other than that, he was a perfect little angel, focusing on internal stability within his own kingdom of Aragon. But times of peace make for soft men. With little to no conflict to tend to in his later years, Martin grew older and wider. By 1410, at age 53, the king was rather rotund, wrinkled, and in a risky state of health, both physically and mentally. You see, his wife and his 4 children had died, leaving him all alone on his throne. He had married his distant and much younger cousin as a last-ditch effort to produce an heir, but with no success. The depressed and obese king had little more to live for, and would instead gorge himself in solitude. On one fateful night, the king had just downed a whole roasted goose by himself. Where does he put it all? If you've ever slammed down a large meal too quickly, you usually get some pretty bad indigestion, or as I like to call it, the ERP. Since this was the land before Tums, the king had to sleep off his discomfort. He lumbered up to his royal chambers and shimmied himself into his rather strong bed. To cheer himself up a bit, Martin clapped his greasy meat hooks together, summoning his court jester for some late night entertainment so he could hop aboard the train to Sleepytime Junction with a smile, even though he had no idea what a train even was. The jester apparently took his sweet time while being summoned, as he was asked about where he was the moment he entered the king's chambers. And this was when all hell broke loose.
What the heck took you so long?
Well, now hold on. I can't in good conscience let this play out with at least putting up a disclaimer. What you're about to hear is the joke that supposedly ended a nearly 300-year medieval dynasty. This is not for the faint of heart. You were warned. I was in the next vineyard, where I saw a young deer hanging by his tail from a tree, as if someone had so punished him for stealing figs. The king lost his absolute shit, reportedly slapping his belly in laughter for 3 hours straight, eventually falling out of his bed and collapsing on the ground where he lay dead from an apparent heart attack. With no heirs to assume the throne, the House of Barcelona, after ruling the Crown of Aragon for 273 years, fell after the delivery of a single joke. Now, of course, historians debate if this story is even true, as some accounts have Martin dying of the plague, food poisoning, or complications from his weight, but those aren't nearly as funny. Archduke Alexander Leopold of Austria was a big dumb nerd. While the world of royalty focused on politics, land grabbing, and who could kill who more effectively, Alex instead played with his chemistry set in the corner, scribbling notes in a language called mathematics. It's no surprise that young Alex took a liking to the sciences, as his dad, Holy Roman Emperor Guy Leopold II, was a strong advocate for Enlightenment principles and the study of natural sciences.
Today's lesson is called gravity.
Whoa, gravity. But since he was still an emperor's son, involvement in politics was inevitable. Take, for instance, the Kingdom of Hungary. It wasn't officially part of the Holy Roman Empire, but it was somehow still ruled by it. There were governors in charge, but Emperor Leopold was all, here's my son. Make him do something. And thus, little Alex was elected into a lordship position known as a palatine. He had a pretty good time in that position, until the Jacobin conspiracy. A group of rebels were trying to have the Kingdom of Hungary break free from all Holy Roman Empire control, instead giving the royal crown to Alex. He very firmly said no, and the rebels were punished severely. With all of this political nonsense, Alex yearned for the simpler times of just mixing chemicals together to see what blows up. So in 1795, at the age of 22, Alex left Hungary for Vienna, Austria, and took up residence in Laxenburg Palace. But one summer, the young Archduke decided to turn up the heat and dabble in homemade pyrotechnics, a hobby that is famous for its safe and non-destructive nature. Expecting a visit from his cousin, Alex decided to rig up an extravagant fireworks display inside the palace. Hey, just cause you're educated doesn't mean you're smart. To be fair, he, along with a few servants, set up the show within a fortified armory called a casemate, with the intent of firing the rockets towards the outside. So it's not like he decided to just shove firecrackers into a kitchen cabinet for shits and gigs. He was a man of science after all. Nevertheless, all gunpowder and makeshift explosives were stored inside the fortified walls. When his cousin arrived, he attempted to fire off the first rocket, but since Mother Nature has great comedic timing, a rogue gust of wind blew the rocket over, launching itself into other explosives and gunpowder reserves. Everything exploded, engulfing the Archduke and his servants in a goodness gracious great ball of fire. Talk about going out with a bang, am I right? The title of king kinda just fell into the lap of old Adolf Frederick of Sweden in 1751. During the Age of Liberty, a time in history when the Swedish parliament was all... Adolf's rule as king was essentially worthless. He was no more than a political figurehead while all the real guys in fancy wigs did the ruling.
but apparently not very well because by the end of the Age of Liberty in 1772, Sweden was kind of worse for the wear. Its land ownership had diminished, trade had evaporated, and technological advancements were lagging. So Sweden was forced to sit back and watch its neighbors and rivals proudly wave around their large, throbbing economies. During King Adolf's lavishly lackadaisical leadership, nothing extraordinary happened.
The substandard sovereign did attempt to regain power, but failed to do so, because he sucked.
In fact, his entire reign is seen as a dull but peaceful lull in Swedish history with not much to show for it. And unfortunately for the king, the only exciting point in his life, at least from a historical perspective, was his death. According to some historical records, the rather indulgent king had overindulged himself on some food. On February 12, 1771, the king's last supper reportedly consisted of lobster, caviar, sauerkraut, smoked herring, and champagne. Oh, and a few of these bad boys. This is a semla, a traditional Swedish sweet roll stuffed with almond paste and whipped cream, and hot damn does it look tasty. And that's exactly what the king thought as he inhaled 14 of them. Not surprisingly, all of that food did not sit well in the king's tummy, and all that internal stress is believed to have caused heart failure. The poor guy straight up ate himself to death. Now, before the actually crowd starts pounding away on their greasy keyboards, this tale of his death is regarded as propaganda and is highly discredited by modern historians. The official autopsy report for the king has survived all of these years and has concluded, based on all the evidence that they could gather from sleuthing around the king's insides, that his royal majesty had a stroke. Now, suffering from a stroke is rough, but for a king that wasn't up to par, it's a fair way to go. That's some golf humor for you.
Ridiculous jobs that no longer exist. In this day and age, we really take for granted just how quick and easy it is to be able to communicate. Back in the days of yore, not everyone was rolling around at the speed of sound. It could take several weeks to be able to relay critical information to your buddies, and a lot can change in just a few weeks. Nevertheless, delayed information was better than no information at all, and that's why highly trained long-distance messengers could make or break empires. First used thousands of years ago in ancient times, couriers were the best and fastest form of communication pretty much up until the invention of the telegraph in 1837. Sure, boats and trains made things a tad bit faster, but the principle was pretty much unchanged, physically transporting documents from point A to point B. The earliest and most sophisticated courier system of its time was that of the massive and girthy Achaemenid Empire, also known as, or at least considered to be, the First Persian Empire. They constructed the Angarium, a series of relay stations littered across the Royal Road, the main vein of the empire. This connected two major cities within the empire, Susa and Sardis. Can you deliver this message to Sardis? Yeah, no problem at all. Sardis, no. The Royal Road stretched across 1,700 miles of the empire's western half with patrolling guards and security stations at regular intervals, making it heavily secured. I mean, it kind of had to be. Messengers traveling down the road were carrying the orders from the great king himself, so they were pretty important. Anyone severing or intercepting that line of communication could cause devastating effects. Also at regular intervals were checkpoints. These were relay stations that housed freshly charged horses as well as other messengers ready to pass things along down the line. This system of stations dropped delivery time from roughly 90 days on foot to just 7 to 9 days on horseback. But what if you didn't have horses? Well, we'd have to ask the Inca. Jump forward 2,000 years to the 1500s, and not much has changed in the ways of communication. In fact, one could argue that it was way worse. With no horses around, Incan runners instead relied on their piggies. Messengers of the king, called the chasquis, were slim, fit, and ready to rip, carrying messages across the vast mountainsides of the Inca Empire. Unlike their Persian counterparts, the Inca didn't carry the messages in their pockets, but rather their noggins. And that's because the Inca did not have any formal written language. Wild, right? Instead, apart from some complex numerical systems involving tied knots of string, everything was spoken, so a strong memory was the key to getting the right message across. The chasquis were tasked with relaying the king's orders to nearby provinces and military commanders.
Tell the soldiers that they're doing a solid job and to keep up the great work.
Yes, my king. The Inca, though, did rely on relay stations to always have a fresh pair of legs ready to deliver a message. According to Spanish chroniclers, that's a fun word to say, each station was about a half a league apart. but could be as far as 1.5 leagues. That's over 5 miles, or for you metric fellas, over 832,000 centimeters. The stations were more or less weather-resistant small huts with other Chaskeys standing about, ready to get a move on. Upon arriving, the first messenger would give the oral performance for his buddies, and then repeat the message that he came with. After memorizing the information, the next Chasky sprinted up to 5 miles to the next station. Now keep in mind, this was the Inca Empire. It wasn't easily traversed flat road. It was pretty much uphill both ways, wobbly, cobbly stone roads 10,000 feet above sea level, on par with how our parents walk to and from school every day, or so they claim. The king said to slob his knob, and that Greg's a jerk. The fuck did I do? It's unfortunate that sometimes things get lost in translation, but remember the first rule of exchanging information. Never shoot the messenger. Leave it to the English to come up with some spooky dooky hocus pocus type stuff. If you're extremely poor and a social outcast with no lucrative or meaningful skills whatsoever, then the profession of Sin Eater might have been on the menu for you.
Blimey.
Historically, the job was performed throughout the early 17th century up until the 19th century, mostly in England, Scotland, and Wales. So just this area. As a Sin Eater, you were always on call for your services, as people have a tendency of kicking the bucket at any given time. So while you sat slapping mud around all day outside your thatched roof cottage, you could receive the news of a local death at the drop of a hat.
Oh, he's dead.
A relative or loved one would seek out your services almost immediately after the passing had passed. Once you were summoned, you'd pull up your britches and tween off screen to convene with the spiritually unclean. Arriving at the door, you politely knock before entering. You waddle inside to see your new customer and get to work. So your job as the local Sin Eater was to, as you could probably guess, eat the sins of the deceased, as praying and repentance apparently wasn't good enough. Now, the eating of the sins was of course symbolic in nature, but it was conducted in a literal fashion. The family of the dearly departed presented the Sin Eater with food, usually bread and beer. The food was placed on the chest or face of the individual right as they had passed away, supposedly sucking up all the bad juju as the soul floated to regions beyond. So, now with the food being properly seasoned with a pinch of immorality and a dash of transgression, it was time to chow down. The basic idea of the whole ceremony was that you would effectively absolve the dead of any wrongdoings committed in life, allowing them a clean slate departure for the heavens as a certified good boy. Now you're probably not surprised to learn that this was far from a Michelin star dining experience. The bread was all stale and the beer was warm with a bunch of gross floaties in it, perfect for the hipsters, but less than ideal for normal people. So after munching and crunching and glugging and chugging, you'd say a quick yet emotionally packed prayer. Rub-dub-dub, thanks for the grub. Yay, God.
Where's the shitter?
Now with a proper sense of closure, you'd receive your paltry fee and be promptly vacated from the premises. So while your work of purifying one's soul was well appreciated, you were looked down upon, even outcasted. The belief was that you'd retain all of these absorbed sins, polluting your own soul in the process. That being the case, Sin Eaters were forced to live reclusive and isolated lives, being hated, ridiculed, and shunned by the locals. Until it was time to deep throat a sin or 12. It's not exactly clear how the tradition of sin eating was started. Some believe that it derives from the Jewish tradition of the scapegoat, a literal goat that was imbued with all of the local sins and troubles, sent out into the wilderness and actively prodded off a cliff, taking all of the town's trials and tribulations with it. Atonement complete. Thanks, Mr. Goat. As for sin eating, it seems that the tradition was finally laid to rest in the beginning of the 20th century with the death of Richard Munslow, the last known sin eater in England. He reportedly was a humble and well-loved farmer who took on the job after the premature deaths of his children. Very sad. All in all, sin eating really was a self-sacrifice when you look at it, trading in any sense of social standing for a few pence. But hey, free bread and beer. If you thought your childhood was rough, imagine dipping, diving, ducking, and dodging your way through cannon fire while slugging a heavy sack of gunpowder on a ship in the middle of the ocean. That's what powder monkeys had to deal with almost on a daily basis. So while you may have been pissed at your mom for taking your Game Boy away for a few days, powder monkeys were grateful if they even saw tomorrow. Back during the Age of Sail, naval warfare was a pretty common occurrence, ships just blasting big metal balls at each other in hopes of sinking the other guy faster or causing enough damage to warrant a surrender. In order to give yourself a fighting chance, you needed a well-trained, well-supplied crew who knew their way around cannons. Besides ammunition, the cannons needed a propellant to send those cannonballs barreling at the faces of the enemy. That propellant, of course, was gunpowder. In the heat of battle, every trained sailor needed to man their stations and execute their responsibilities in order to have a decent shot at survival. But one responsibility that didn't need much training outside of carry this shit and run over there was that of supplying powder to the cannoneers. Since there wasn't much to the job description, the task was given to young boys, usually between the ages of 12 and 14. You see, back in this time, between the 16th and 19th centuries, people were just cranking out kids, especially the poor. Simultaneously, nature was just cranking out infectious and deadly diseases, and industry was cranking out fatal working conditions, both of which were promptly streamlining children into the orphanage pipeline. This, of course, caused orphanages to become overburdened, and they needed some relief. And where's the best place to put able-bodied youngsters just looking for any kind of future? The military, of course. European and eventually American navies were scooping up hundreds of impoverished chaps each year and dumping them on ships to take on the role of powder monkey, more often than not against their will. But the young lads were quicker, more agile, and physically smaller than their adult counterparts, making them perfect candidates for the job. During a battle, each boy would quickly carry at least 2 leather cases housing powder cartridges from the ship's powder magazine deep down in the hull, all the way up to the cannons. A dangerous job for sure, but a critical one for the success of the skirmish.
Oi, lad, bring me that very explosive powder, eh? And be quick about it.
Yes, sir. Right away, sir.
That's a good lad.
In exchange, the young fellows were clothed, fed, and given beds, even a little bit of education to fill their heads. The plan was to have the boys eventually become official, full-time members of the Navy, assuming that they survived to adulthood. Yet despite the fact that they were a key part of the crew, they held no formal naval rank on the ships which they served. Now, while it was nice to have a place to call home, clothes on your back, and food in your belly, it of course came with the steep price of witnessing the horrors of war. Just to clarify, I said that powder monkeys were usually between the ages of 12 and 14, but in reality, some were much younger, with some documentation showing cases of children as young as 7 years old. These little guys were subjected to watching their fellow crewmen being blown to smithereens, impaled by split bits of ship, blinded by shrapnel, or having limbs ripped from rogue cannon fire. None of which they were immune to themselves, mind you. It wasn't until the end of the War of 1812 that formal regulations were put in place, preventing any recruitment of powder monkeys under the age of 12 from serving on ships in the United States. The British followed in suit with an age limit of 13 for the role, though these age restrictions were still often ignored. The practice did, however, fully die out in the mid-1800s once child labor laws were put in place and technology made the role obsolete. Sorry kids, looks like it's a big old box of PTSD for Christmas this year. Medieval medicine was wild. Physicians back then were really just throwing anything at the wall to see what stuck, which led to a bunch of strange medical practices that would, luckily, fall out of favor once modern medicine emerged. One such practice was that of uroscopy, the art and science of checking out your pee to determine your health. Now I know what you're thinking. Isn't this still used in the modern day? Yes, but no. Urinalysis, as it's practiced today, uses chemical, physical, and microscopic analysis of urine samples to generate quantitative data for diagnosis. Uroscopy, on the other hand, well, it had dudes snooping, sniffing, and sipping your pee. Well, Doc? I need a second opinion. Now, you might be surprised to know that the practice of uroscopy has been around for thousands and thousands of years. The earliest known evidence that historians have dates all the way back to the 4th millennium BC, where some ancient Sumerian physicians took note of urinary color. Perhaps the most profound early evidence that we have comes from the ancient Egyptians around 1550 BC. This is the Ebers Papyrus, a 65-foot-long medical scroll from ancient Egypt's New Kingdom era. This single document details over 800 diagnoses and remedies for all kinds of conditions ranging from skin problems, eye problems, burns, tumors, a limp, broken bones, backwards teeth, brown parasites, and of course, urinary conditions. The study and examination of urine continued for a while, but the formal occupation of uroscopist is believed to have been introduced between the 4th and 7th centuries in the Byzantine Empire, hitting its peak in the Middle Ages. According to medieval Welsh medical texts, it was believed that urine was the filtrate of the 4 humors: black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood. Of course, we now know that your pee is the product of your kidneys filtering your blood and excess water, but hey, medical science was still a baby back then. Because of this theory, uroscopists believed that urine was the end-all be-all for determining a person's health status, and thus, it was the most important substance to study. The most telling quality of the urine was its color, so after collecting a fresh sample, a real fresh sample, the color was immediately observed. But a problem with qualitative analysis is that it's completely subjective, whereas quantitative is objective. When it comes to subjectivity, one PP doctor may interpret the same color differently than another. For objectivity, numbers are numbers, there's no argument there. In order to mitigate subjectivity and establish some sort of consistency, the piss percipients often constructed quick reference guides to use as a standard for diagnosis, sharing their knowledge across heavily detailed manuscripts. As an example, if your urine was clear, you might have some spleen issues. If it was dark red, your liver's too hot. Green, you've got jaundice. Black, well, wait, is black urine a thing? Oh God. Yeah, I don't think you're gonna be doing too well if you're inking out your dink. While you had the visual aspect, uroscopists also ventured down the avenues of smell and taste to solidify the reasonings if a diagnosis couldn't be immediately deciphered from color alone. Urine that tasted sweet was evidence of diabetes, whereas stinky pee-pee usually meant infection. Now, while this may seem silly looking at it through a modern lens, there was some validity to the practice. Uroscopists were able to properly diagnose conditions like diabetes and jaundice through their practices. Diagnosis was great and all, but without proper and effective treatment, you're not going to be making much progress, except just being closer to the grave. It's like if someone tells you, hey, your car is broken, and then proceeds to offer no meaningful solution. At that point, they're just taking the piss. The ultra wealthy really love spending their money on stupid shit. They love it, in fact. When you've got more money than you could spend in 50 lifetimes, why not? Dumping the most expensive champagne on luxury watches, a 5th mansion on the beach, rigging elections, whatever tickles their sacks. But ostentatious spending is nothing new. You see, back in the 1700s, wealthy estate owners in England, Ireland, and Scotland were bored out of their skulls. I mean, think about it. The extent of dopamine rushes back then were what? Attending yet another opulent ball, hunting some wildlife, racing a horse or two, then putting them down when they don't win. And when you felt like a real degenerate, you had excessive gambling. But these frivolous activities got stale real quick. There needed to be something fresh, something grand, something right in your own backyard. That's when the idea of the English landscape garden started to bloom, transforming sprawling grounds of estates into picturesque and serene scenes. Replacing the clear-cut and formal gardens of their French counterparts, English landscapes were to appear engineered by nature itself, with natural slopes, ponds, groupings of trees and flowers, a nice boulder or two, and organic decoration. These established wonderful getaways for owners and guests alike to retreat and get in touch with nature. But for some, all the stone and trees and grass just wasn't cutting it. Something was missing, something human, like a person. Believe it or not, some wealthy fellas sought out to hire real-life people as decorations for their gardens. Take, for example, one Joseph Pocklington. Born into a wealthy banking family and receiving his inheritance at just 26 years old, his priority was to just spend the shit out of it. After all, what's the point of having money if you don't spend it? As my dad always tells me, you only live once, son. Enjoy it. Well, Mr. Pocklington over here made damn sure he was going to enjoy the life he was given. After purchasing his own private island on a lake, he commissioned the construction of his own armed fortress, a druid temple, and several natural grottos. In order to make the estate seem more lively, he advertised employment for a man to live in his garden, demanding that the man, quote, live for 7 years without washing or cutting his hair or nails. The man was to never speak or interact with any guests and would spend his lonely days in an artificial cave. The basic idea was for guests to observe a man in his most natural state, untouched by societal influence. If the man was able to carry out these conditions, he would be paid the equivalent of about $100,000 in today's money. Now that's spread over the whole 7 years, so it's not really that much. But the position was dubbed the Ornamental Garden Hermit. Now get this, Pocklington was not the only fella to come up with this idea. Others employed their own hermits with much more lenient rules. Perhaps the most well-known example was the Hill family from Shropshire. Their botanical bro was dubbed Father Francis, and he fully interacted with guests, told stories, and dispensed his own wisdom, all while maintaining a mysterious yet comforting presence.
I want to see the hermit, mummy. I want to see the hermit.
The trend of the ornamental garden hermit lasted just over a century, finally being uprooted in the 1830s in favor of living statues. And to answer your question, no, garden gnomes were not inspired by the garden hermit. Those came from Germanic folklore, hundreds of years prior, but they'll still guard your garden as best they can.
Hey guys, today we're gonna see how some small mistakes in history led to some pretty big consequences, so strap in with your favorite toothpaste and orange juice, cause here we go. King of Scots Alexander III was revered by his subjects as a kind and noble king, so he was a pretty cool guy. He put an end to an ongoing war with Norway with the signing of the Treaty of Perth. This stopped the invading Vikings from doing their stereotypical graping and pillaging and made them frig off back to Norway. The treaty also let Scotland gain possession of the Western Isles and the Isle of Man. With all this land expansion going on, as well as increased exports and cash flow, Scotland entered a bit of a golden age. Everything was pretty good until it wasn't. After all, no story is complete without some good old-fashioned character development from a Disney Pixar family tragedy. In the mid-1280s, King Alexander's wife, Queen Margaret, bit the dust, which was pretty devastating since they were married since childhood. Well, at least he had his own children to care for. Except for the fact that they all died too. Little Margaret Jr., who hilariously became Queen of Norway, expired at the age of 22 while pooping out her only child, a daughter named Margaret. We'll get to her later. Alex Jr. died on his 20th birthday at the age of 20. Don't know how he died either, sources just say he just died. The youngest child, David, also kicked an uneventful bucket at age 19. With his family tree essentially trimmed down to the trunk, Alex was desperate to generate new successors, so he married a French countess, Yolande of Dreux. She moved in with the king, but like in a different town for some reason. Well, one night the king was acting pretty eager to perform, so he set out to do the deed of sowing his seed, and nothing was going to block his urge to splurge. Nope, not even that. Despite pleads and warnings from bro-code breaking advisors, the king set out to get his dunk sunked. He had a few of his servants accompany him as guides, and they made it to the queen, but the king, on the other hand, got separated in the harsh storm and was subsequently yeeted off of his horse over a cliff where he was found the next morning, dead as a doornail. With no other heir, it was Margaret Jr.'s time to shine. But since she was only 3 years old and with the attention span of a goldfish, the political landscape of Scotland fell into ruin, ending the short-lived golden age, all because the king needed to slam some sweet queen skush. As I'm sure you know, the luxurious ocean liner Titanic was the ship of dreams that ended up becoming a complete nightmare. The ship died in 1912 after Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet distracted the two lookouts in the crow's nest from observing the giant fucking iceberg floating several hundred feet in front of them. Despite the crew's best efforts, the ship collided with the iceberg and got flushed into the North Atlantic a few hours later. Joking aside, it is believed that the entire disaster could have been prevented, or at least significantly reduced, if it weren't for one key mistake: an actual missing key. Lookouts Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee were tasked with the important task of making sure that no icebergs were in the ship's path. In the crow's nest, the two men were equipped with a warning bell and a telephone to alert crew of any potential dangers in the chilled waters ahead. They also had one more tool, a pair of binoculars which were secured in a box, a locked box, with a missing key. Apparently, this key was accidentally taken off of the ship before it set sail by a second officer, David Blair. What's this here in my pocket? Huh. I'm sure that's not a big deal. With no binoculars, the lookouts had to rely on eyesight alone. And that wouldn't be so terrible if it weren't for the fact that the night was extremely dark, cold, and calm, making it very hard to see icebergs. Luckily, there were almost none all night. Almost. Both lookouts miraculously survived the sinking and, when interviewed, agreed that if they had binoculars, they could have seen the iceberg and reacted more quickly, avoiding the unnecessary loss of over 1,500 lives, but dooming James Cameron's film career. The key, donated to the British Sailor Society by Officer Blair's daughter, was eventually sold at auction for 90,000 British pounds. If you've ever dealt with the trouble of remembering how many tablespoons are in a gallon or that there's 660 feet in a furlong, you probably long for the ease of the metric system. Being an American myself, I'm genetically inclined to detest the anti-freedom units, but getting an engineering degree made me appreciate the simplicity of the metric system. I mean, guys, it's really great. Everything is just a multiplicative of 10. Kilogram, it's 1,000 grams. A meter, it's 100 centimeters. Like, wow, amazing. Anyway, that convenience was stolen from us by a band of scallywag pirates during America's infancy. In 1793, Secretary of State Thomas Mother Effin Jefferson recognized that the United States needed to standardize their units of measure as multiple systems were being used, making commercial trading a logistical nightmare. Luckily, the French of all people had an answer. Scientist Joseph Dombey was dispatched to the United States with a special gift, a carefully crafted copper cylinder which would serve as the revolutionary new standard in weight measurement, the kilogram. Just one component of France's newly developing metric system. While sailing to the States with his cylinder in one hand and the kilogram in the other, Dombey's ship was blown off course by a storm. Now headed for the 1700s Caribbean. British pirates at the time usually attacked non-British ships to impede their trade, and unfortunately Dombey was one of those victims. He was held hostage for ransom but died in captivity. Dombey's death meant that Jefferson never got the metric standard, meaning it was never adopted. So the United States stuck with the English units as their standard. While it is possible that we could all be measuring our all-beef francs using centimeters, it's doubtful, as multiple attempts over the years to implement the metric system have been defeated at the greasy hand of American pride. Ethiopia and Italy typically aren't two countries that you would hear about in the same sentence, but during the late 1800s when Africa was getting absolutely reamed by colonization, Italy had its sights set on some potential land expansion candidates, one of them being, you guessed it, Eritrea, Ethiopia's northern neighbor. This led to a bit of an unofficial scuffle called the Italo-Ethiopian War of 1887, which lasted for 2 years and ended with Italy formally occupying Eritrea and the signing of the Treaty of Wuchal. Among other rules, the treaty basically stated that peace was to remain between Italy and Ethiopia. However, one article had two different meanings between languages. In Italian, the article stated that Ethiopia must act through Italy if they wish to do business with other governments. The Amharic or Ethiopian version stated that Ethiopia can act through Italy for external business, which suggested that it wasn't mandatory. Very different things. The treaty was nonetheless signed, and eventually the two countries clashed again. Italy claimed that it had full control over Ethiopia's external affairs, but Ethiopia claimed, "Nuh-uh, dude." Italy then invaded Ethiopia in 1895, starting the official First Italo-Ethiopian War. With Italy's army of 44,000 against Ethiopia's 125,000, the Italians ended up getting their spaghetti-eating teeth kicked in, securing Ethiopia's independence in 1896. Until Italy invaded again in 1935. Italy won that time. All in all, around 25,000 lives were lost during the First Italo-Ethiopian War, all because Italy decided to skip its daily Duolingo sessions. When you're a power-hungry dictator to millions of food-hungry citizens, your people will probably hate you, which is something that Joseph Stalin was shocked to find out when leading the Soviet Union from 1924 until his death in 1953. Although he came into power with some strong initial support, it quickly dried up as his first few years sucked eggs. He went balls deep into national industrialization and uprooted the agricultural system. No food means famine, and famine means people die. So, people died. Millions of them. Stalin was now officially an asshole, and assholes need to be wiped clean. His political rivals demanded his removal, prompting Stalin to switch to defense mode. In doing so, he began stringent investigations of the government for anyone who might even toy with the idea of questioning his policies. Yes, hello, I have question. No one was safe. During what came to be known as the Great Purge between 1936 and 1938, Stalin expanded his investigations to anyone he deemed a threat to the Soviet Union. By the end, there were over 700,000 documented executions of workers, artists, teachers, whoever, while in reality it is estimated to be about 1.2 million. Even his own Red Army saw 37,000 soldiers executed or sentenced to labor camps. And these weren't just lowly foot soldiers either, I'm talking like commanders and generals, his top guys. Stalin was absolutely unhinged, with his paranoia destroying his mental and physical health. He ended up surviving a severe heart attack and a stroke in 1945, with his health never fully recovering. On the night of February 28, 1953, Stalin was chilling with some bros, watching movies and having dinner. After a long night of joking and smooches, Stalin retired to his private quarters, specifically instructing not to be disturbed until he woke up the next morning. Well, the next morning came and nothing. Afternoon, nothing. Remember that even his closest friends were terrified of defying him lest they be sent to the gulag. Night came, still nothing. And by now, they're pretty worried. It wasn't until 11 p.m. that a housekeeper dared to check on Stalin. He was found on the ground unconscious and unresponsive. Still terrified to call the doctor, it took another 8 hours for Stalin to receive medical attention. With an extremely high blood pressure of 190/110, Stalin had suffered another intense stroke. He received around-the-clock care for 3 days before he ultimately despawned on March 5th, 1953. Had he been kinder to his bros and not such a complete butthole, he may have been treated sooner and survived his ailment, even if it was short-lived. The Soviet Union eventually collapsed in 1991. And there we have it. You can clearly see how small itty-bitty mistakes can lead to some severe consequences. So be sure to never make another mistake in your life.